Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, dangerous, and not so glamorous world of medieval assassins. Those shadowy figures who crept through castle halls and darkened alleys to change history with a blade and a whisper. While Hollywood makes them look cool, the truth is, being a medieval assassin seriously sucked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear. No one in medieval times woke up and said, "You know what? I'd like to stab a nobleman in the throat for 12 silver coins and the honor of hiding in a barrel for 3 days." Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was more like a last stop on the life went horribly wrong train. Most medieval assassins weren't mysterious loners trained in mountaintop temples. They were desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, ex-thieves with decent aim, or people so far off society's radar they could kill a man and still not be noticed in the census. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a go to your name, you were in management. But if you just escaped debtor's prison, had a reputation for solving problems, and could sneak into a tavern without being seen, congratulations, someone, somewhere, was about to slide a coin purse across the table and whisper a name. And that name wasn't a fun one because you weren't asked to take out Bob the quiet turnip farmer. It was usually a corrupt baron, a bishop with too much gold, or someone with 12 bodyguards and a moat. The pay was tempting, certainly, but the job itself was absolutely horrifying. But by the time someone considered it, they had nothing left to lose: no family, no future, and definitely no dental plan. Plus, let's not forget the absolute lack of job perks, because there was no pension, no glory, and certainly no evenings off. You couldn't exactly hang up a shingle that said, "Quiet eliminations by appointment," so you just had to stay quiet, move fast, and never ever tell anyone what you did for a living. Especially not loudly over ale at the inn, where you might be tempted to explain the strange stains on your tunic, forcing you to lie and say, "Oh yeah, I'm a traveling carpet seller, and the stains? Ah, die, so yes." Nobody dreamed of being a medieval assassin. They landed there because the world chewed them up and spat them out wearing a hood and holding a rusty dagger. You weren't the hero, you weren't even the villain. You were the footnote that made everyone nervous and probably didn't live to enjoy the coin. Let's burst the first myth wide open right now. Medieval assassins didn't train under candlelight in some hidden monastery, with wise mentors and inspirational flute music in the background. There was no montage, no teacher, no pep talk, and if you learned anything, it was strictly by not dying the first few times you tried. Most assassins weren't trained professionals. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the ability to climb quietly without sneezing. If you had military experience, great, because that meant you knew how to hold a knife properly. But if not, well, stabbing someone is fairly intuitive, but escaping afterward with both kidneys still intact takes skill or luck. Usually just luck. There were no manuals, no guild orientation meetings, no safety briefings, and you didn't get taught how to spot a body double or where nobles keep their bedroom exits. You figured it out while hanging from a windowsill, wondering if you just crept into the servants' quarters again. Poison. That was trial and error, with heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your target just got mildly dizzy and more suspicious of his soup. And sometimes you drank the wrong cup. There was no medieval poison control hotline. Just hope, herbal guesswork, and a strong stomach. Sure, if you were lucky, and I mean lottery lucky, you might have picked up some skills from thieves or mercenaries. Maybe an older assassin showed you how to walk without squeaking on cobblestones. But mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and short-lived because assassins don't retire, they disappear. Weapons training? Forget it, because you weren't carrying a broadsword. You had a dagger you stole off a guard, maybe a garrote if you were feeling fancy, and whatever else fit under your cloak without jingling. So no, you weren't some shadowy martial arts master. You were a guy with calloused hands, quiet footsteps, and a deeply unhealthy relationship with alleyways. Success didn't come from training. It came from survival, learning how to kill by doing it quickly, soppily, then vanishing before anyone could sketch your face and tack it to a church door. In short, Your education was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies, just bruises, bloodstains, and a creeping realization that you were very much on your own. Let's talk about why you became an assassin in the first place. Coin. Cold, heavy, generally, deliciously spendable coin. The promise of it is what got you into this, but the reality was that you often got paid in lies. When someone hires an assassin, they don't want a long-term relationship. They want a one-time service, no paperwork, and ideally no witnesses, including you. They offer you a pouch of silver, half now, half when the job is done, if they're feeling generous. But here's the thing, when the job is done is code for after we verify you didn't mess it up, or make us look bad, or leave a trail that leads back to us, or survive long enough to tell anyone about it. So, you do the job. You sneak through shadows, risk your life, maybe kill a baron in his sleep. Not pretty, not poetic, and when you return, ah yes, about that payment, the client fled, terribly sorry. Or worse, they try to kill you because a knife to the gut is cheaper than a bonus. And even when you do get paid, it's never quite enough. Not for the risk, not for the blood, not for the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas and moral regret. You get a handful of coins, a curt nod, and a reminder you were never here. Also, fun fact, some contracts were fake, strictly political traps. You'd be told to assassinate someone dangerous, only to find out it was a decoy with guards waiting. Meaning, congratulations, you just walked into a sting operation with your name already carved on the gallows. And even when the deal was real, you couldn't exactly go to court and file a complaint saying, "Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassin contract." The only court you'd see was the one where you were the exhibit. So you learned to take what you could, demand payment up front, and trust absolutely no one. Not even the greasy little scribe who swore this job would change your life. It did, mostly by shortening it. Being an assassin meant living on broken promises and vanishing before they broke you. So you've taken the job. You've been lied to about the pay, and you're probably going to die. Now, let's talk gear. Forget the fantasy novels and sneaky video games because there were no retractable wrist blades, smoke bombs, enchanted daggers, or crossbows that folded neatly into your boot. Your toolkit consisted of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath a tattered cloak without clanking. If you were lucky, and I mean found a gold coin in a dead man's shoe lucky, you had a good dagger. Not ornate, not curved like a dragon's tooth, just sharp, hopefully rust-free, and ideally one that didn't smell like the last guy you stabbed with it. Poison existed, sure, but it wasn't as glamorous as a slow drip into a wine goblet. Most medieval poisons were unpredictable, made from plants, minerals, or toad guts. Some worked instantly, some took hours, and some made your victim vomit for 2 days and then recover, angrier and now very suspicious of stew. Ropes were occasionally useful, allowing you to strangle, climb, or tie something up, but you'd better know how to use it fast, because nothing kills the mood like trying to wrestle someone while muttering, "Wait, which knot goes under again?" Bows were effective. Yes, if you had one, knew how to shoot it, and weren't trying to smuggle it through a palace disguised as a flower arranger. Most assassinations were up close and personal, leaving no time for elegant marksmanship, just quick, quiet, and hopefully not messy enough to slip in. And you didn't get backups. If your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well, it was time to improvise. Slate roof tile? Maybe. Rusty nail? Worth a shot. Shoe buckle with intent? Desperate times. You carried your tools hidden in hems, boots, or inside hollowed-out bread if needed. And you kept them close, not for safety, but because in this line of work, your weapon was your best friend, your boss, and your only retirement plan. There were no upgrades, no tinkering with gear between missions. You didn't polish your kit. You prayed it didn't betray you mid-strike. Because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing, it was you alone, poorly equipped, and expected to perform miracles with a spoon and a prayer. Assassins weren't hired to take out random drunks in back alleys. No one paid you to stab Jeff, the sleepy candle maker. Your targets were important. Nobles, bishops, military officers, sometimes even royalty. And those people were very hard to kill. First, there were the guards, not one or two, but dozens who were armed, armored, and well-fed. Some guarded the front, some the back, and some just stood there looking intimidating, daring you to blink wrong. You'd spend days memorizing patrol patterns, door creaks, and exactly how many stairs it took before the knight with asthma needed a breather. Second, there were walls. Castles didn't have front porches. They had gatehouses, murder holes, and moats full of things that bite. If you didn't fall into the water, you still had to worry about arrow slits and boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description included may get flamed for peeking. Third, there were the servants and staff, the cooks, scribes, and stable boys. One wrong look from you, and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could say, "I'm just the herbalist." Assassins weren't just fighting swords, they were fighting gossip, and medieval gossip travels at light speed, if it means someone gets to keep their head. And finally, your actual target, paranoid, and rightfully so. These people were surrounded by backstabbers, relatives with claims to their titles, and 36 people pretending to like them. They didn't eat without a tester. They didn't sleep without 3 locks on the door. And some even slept in decoy beds or rotated rooms like a deadly version of musical chairs. And don't get excited if you hear they're attending a feast because yes, they'll be drunk, but so will you, and you'll still have to get past the royal guards, 3 dogs, a very alert jester, and 50 witnesses holding tankards. Even getting close to your target could take weeks of posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, or hiding in barrels. And when the moment finally came, you had one short, one precise, perfect, not squeaky, not bloody ghost vanish in the night moment, or you'd become the next public deterrent, swinging from the castle gate with a sign that read, "Nice try." Let's be honest, when you picture a medieval assassin, you probably imagine sleek black robes, leather braces, maybe a mysterious hood billowing in the moonlight. Reality, you looked like a sick coat herder with something to hide. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't exactly high fashion. You didn't have custom-tailored cloaks or retractable armor. You had whatever you could scavenge. Peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too big, or the remains of a guard uniform that definitely still smelled like its previous owner. The goal was to blend in, but blending in meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, limped from old injuries, and had a nervous twitch from malnutrition. You didn't look suspicious because of your cloak. You looked suspicious because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. And forget masks. There were no Guy Fawkes options. Most face coverings just made you look like a leper, which was great for avoiding conversation, but terrible for entering parties. If anyone asked who you were, you had to think fast and say something like, "I'm Brother Tobias. I take care of silent prayer and rooftop maintenance," even assuming you made it past the guards. Noble households weren't full of idiots. Servants noticed unfamiliar faces, especially ones that fumbled chamber pots and couldn't name the cook's cat. You were always one "I've never seen you before" away from being clubbed with a candlestick. And if your disguise did work, congratulations. You now had to stay in character for hours while pretending not to notice all the very stab-worthy people wandering by. Also, wigs didn't exist in the way you hope. If you needed to look older or younger, you were stuck smearing dirt on your face, squinting, and hoping no one got close enough to notice that your beard was glued on with honey. The truth was, your disguise didn't protect you. It gave you maybe 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you had to be gone, invisible, or very, very convincing. And if anyone saw through it, well, let's just say no one wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room, wearing a nun's habit and holding a sword, especially not on a feast day. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team. You didn't have a sidekick with a crossbow, a clever alchemist in a secret lair, or a handler who gave you coded scrolls and warm encouragement. You had a rusty dagger, and crippling trust issues. There were no guilds, at least not ones you could actually count on. And if there were whispers of a brotherhood of assassins, it was mostly tavern talk, fueled by mead and boredom. You were more likely to meet a ghost than another professional killer who wanted to network. Why the isolation? Because in your business, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you lived. Every contact was a risk, every loose tongue a potential news, and even your client might not know your real name. And if they did, you were already planning your exit. Companionship was laughable because friends asked questions, lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade under the pillow. You couldn't settle down, and you couldn't afford to because one mistake, one person recognizing you in a market, and your whole life turned into a sprint for the nearest sewer grate. Even fellow criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were sociable, but you, You were that guy who makes people disappear. They feared you, or worse, saw you as a walking liability, and no one wanted to share stew with someone whose occupation could attract a mob with torches. Let's talk about the physical reality of your downtime. Because while stories might have you believe that between missions you were lounging in a velvet-draped hideout sharpening your blade, the truth is that you were likely sleeping in a ditch, a leaking barn, or beneath a hedge on the side of a road to avoid drawing attention to yourself. You weren't renting rooms at the inn because innkeepers ask questions. They remember faces, and they talk to the town guard when the wanted posters go up. So you lived a life of exposure to the elements, shivering through rainstorms and sweltering in the summer heat, with nothing but your cloak and the hard ground for comfort. Hygiene was effectively non-existent for someone in your line of work, not just because soap was a luxury, but because looking too clean, too well kept, or smelling like anything other than unwashed peasant and horse manure would instantly mark you as an outsider, essentially forcing you to embrace filth as a survival tactic. You became a walking biohazard, covered in the grime of the road, carrying the distinct odor of desperation, and hosting a thriving colony of lice that kept you scratching through those long, silent nights while you waited for your next target to make a mistake. And speaking of mistakes, we need to address what happened when you inevitably got hurt. Because in a profession that involves scaling rough stone walls, dodging sword swings, and jumping from dangerous heights, injury wasn't a possibility. It was a guarantee. You certainly weren't going to a village doctor or a monastery for healing because a physician asked inconvenient questions like, "Why do you have a dagger wound in your shoulder?" or "How exactly did you get burned by boiling oil?" Questions that usually end with the local sheriff being summoned. So, you became your own surgeon, stitching your own flesh with a dirty needle and thread by the light of a dying campfire, pouring cheap, stinging spirits into the wound to stave off the rot, and biting down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming and alerting the entire forest to your location. Infection was a far more prolific killer of assassins than any castle guard, meaning that a simple rusted nail or a dirty scrape could turn into a slow, feverish death sentence that left you delirious and dying alone in the undergrowth, miles from home and with no one to bury you. Now, let's move on to the actual act of the escape, because Hollywood loves to show the assassin striking the final blow and then gracefully leaping out a window onto a conveniently placed horse to ride off into the sunset. But physics and medieval architecture rarely cooperated so beautifully. The moment your target dropped, the clock started ticking on a chaotic, panic-induced lockdown where every gate was slammed shut, every portcullis dropped, and every guard within a 5-mile radius was mobilized with orders to kill anything that moved. You weren't gliding down a zip line. You were scrambling through a sewer pipe that hadn't been cleaned since the Romans left, holding your breath and praying the tracking dogs lost your scent before you passed out from the noxious fumes. The adrenaline crash after the kill is brutal, leaving you shaking, nauseous, and physically exhausted exactly when you need to be at your most athletic, forcing you to run miles on an empty stomach while every bell in the parish is ringing to alert the countryside that someone just murdered the Duke. If you didn't have a sewer to crawl through, you were likely hiding in the most humiliating places imaginable, like submerging yourself in a cesspit, burying yourself under a pile of manure in the stables, or squeezing into a chimney flue for 2 days without food or water while soldiers poked spears into every shadow below. The glamorous escape usually involved days of harrowing evasion, moving only at night, eating raw turnips you stole from fields, and dodging bounty hunters who were fresh, mounted on horses, and very eager to claim the price on your head. You had to cross rivers without using bridges because bridges have checkpoints, navigate forests without using paths because paths have patrols, and essentially become a wild animal, surviving on instinct and terror until you crossed a border or vanished into a city large enough to swallow you whole. The psychological toll was perhaps the heaviest burden of all, heavier even than the guilt or the fear of capture, because you could never, ever switch off, forcing you to live in a state of permanent hypervigilance where every snapping twig, every sudden silence in a tavern, and every sideways glance from a stranger sent your heart rate spiking into the danger zone. You forgot what it felt like to trust a meal wasn't poisoned, or to sleep with both eyes closed, eventually becoming a hollowed-out shell of a person who jumped at their own shadow, haunted not necessarily by the ghosts of the people you killed, but by the relentless, crushing fear of the inevitable moment when your luck would finally run dry. There was no therapist to talk to, No confessional you could enter without risking execution, so you bottled it up, pushing the paranoia down until it turned you into a twitchy, erratic mess who drank too much to drown out the silence. You also had to deal with the crushing weight of religious guilt, which in the Middle Ages wasn't just a vague feeling of bad vibes, but a terrifying, tangible fear of eternal damnation. You lived in a society that believed heaven and hell were real physical places, and you knew, with absolute certainty, that your job description had booked you a one-way ticket to the fire and brimstone section. Every church bill was a reminder of the salvation you could have, and every funeral procession you passed was a grim foreshadowing of your own unhallowed end, leading many assassins to develop bizarre, superstitious rituals or make anonymous, desperate donations to the poor in a futile attempt to balance a ledger that was already dripping with red ink. Let's face the grim reality that there are no old assassins in this era, only lucky ones and dead ones, and if you were caught, you weren't given a fair trial, a lawyer, or a comfortable cell to write your memoirs in. You were made into a public spectacle designed to terrify anyone else thinking of taking up the trade. The punishments reserved for assassins were creatively horrific, ranging from being broken on the wheel to being dragged by horses, ensuring that your death was slow, public, and agonizingly unglamorous, serving as a final, brutal reminder to the populace that striking at the powerful carries a price no amount of silver can pay. Even if you weren't caught, the retirement plan was non-existent because you couldn't exactly buy a farm and settle down when your face might be recognized by a traveling merchant or a vengeful relative of a past victim. Most assassins who survived the job eventually turned into bandits, mercenaries, or beggars, their skills degrading as age and injury slowed them down, leaving them to die in the same gutters they used to hide in. You didn't get to keep the gold you earned because it was spent on bribes, hush money, replacement weapons, and inflated prices for food when you were on the run, meaning you ended your career just as poor and desperate as you started it, only now with more scars and a lot more enemies. So, when you look back at the history of these shadow walkers, remember that for everyone who successfully changed the course of history with a blade, there were 100 who died shivering in the mud, unnamed, unmourned, and unpaid. It was a life of extreme violence, profound loneliness, and relentless hardship, stripped of all the romance and mystery that fiction has draped over it in the centuries since. It was a job for the damned, performed by the desperate, and the only true reward was surviving long enough to regret it. That's the reality of the medieval assassin. No hoods of satin, no brotherhoods of honor, just a short, brutal life in the dark. We cannot discuss the history of this shadow trade without addressing the elephant in the room, the legendary order of assassins, or the Hashishin of the Levantine Mountains, whose very name gave us the word we use today, yet whose reality was stripped of the video game parka and pristine white hoods, replaced instead by a brutal, cult-like existence of absolute obedience where young men were psychologically broken down and rebuilt into living weapons who sought death as fervently as they sought their target. While the legends speak of a paradise garden filled with milk, honey, and beautiful women used to trick recruits into loyalty, the historical truth is far colder and more pragmatic, involving a rigid hierarchy of indoctrination where you were essentially erased as an individual and reprogrammed to become a disposable extension of the old man of the mountain's political will. If you were a member of this sect, you weren't sneaking around trying to survive. You were often instructed to kill your target in broad daylight, in the middle of a crowded mosque or market square, ensuring that witnesses saw the act, because the terror inspired by your willingness to stand there and be cut down by guards was far more valuable to the leadership than your actual survival. This brings us to a terrifying realization about the mindset required for this job, because unlike the mercenary who kills for coin and wants to live to spend it, the ideological assassin of the Middle Ages was driven by a terrifying fatalism that made them utterly alien to the people they hunted. Imagine the psychological state of waking up on the morning of your mission, washing yourself, saying your prayers, and walking calmly toward a destination you know with absolute certainty will be your grave, carrying nothing but a dagger and the crushing weight of expectation that you must not flinch when the swords of the bodyguards inevitably pierce your skin. There is no glamour in being a suicide weapon, only a profound, tragic waste of human life fueled by the machinations of distant leaders who sit safely in mountain fortresses while you bleed out on the hot cobblestones of a foreign city, despised by the crowd and erased from history the moment your utility is exhausted. Moving away from the specific fanaticism of the Hashishin and looking toward the feudal courts of Europe, the reality of the hired blade was less about religious fervor and more about the grim, dirty business of dynastic feuds where loyalty was bought and sold by the hour. In England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, assassins weren't typically members of a secret society, but rather routiers or demobilized mercenaries who hung around the fringes of military camps. Men who had seen too much war to function in polite society and who had lost the ability to earn a living doing anything other than inflicting violence. These men were often physically wrecked by years of campaigning, suffering from untreated battle wounds, chronic joint pain from sleeping in damp fields, and what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, making them volatile, unpredictable, and often addicted to alcohol or gambling to numb the noise in their heads. When a duke or a count needed a rival removed, he didn't summon a sleek ninja. He sent an intermediary to the darkest corner of a tavern to find a man with dead eyes and a heavy sword who looked desperate enough to do anything for a bag of silver. The resulting assassination wasn't a surgical strike. It was often a messy, chaotic ambush on a muddy road where the assassin and a few hired thugs would overwhelm the target's carriage, bludgeoning and stabbing with a frantic, brutal energy that had zero finesse and left a scene of absolute carnage. There was no clean kill in this context, just the savage reality of blunt force trauma and arterial spray, followed by the frantic looting of the bodies to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. A disguise for the motive that rarely fooled anyone, but provided just enough plausible deniability for the noble who paid the bill. Let's dig deeper into the actual mechanics of staking out a target, because fiction glosses over the excruciating boredom and physical misery of waiting for the perfect moment to strike, a process that could take days or even weeks of absolute stillness in horrific conditions. Imagine finding a vantage point in a drafty, rat-infested hayloft overlooking the courtyard of a manor house, where you must lie prone in the dust and straw for 14 hours a day, unable to move to stretch your cramping muscles, unable to light a fire for warmth, and unable to leave to relieve yourself properly, forcing you to soil your own clothing and lie in the filth to avoid detection. You are watching a window, waiting for a specific candle to be extinguished or a specific door to open, fighting the overwhelming urge to sleep, because if you doze off for 10 minutes and miss the target's movement, the entire weeks of suffering were for nothing and you don't get paid. The weather in medieval Europe did not care about your cinematic moment. It rained incessantly, turning your observation post into a freezing mud pit, or it snowed, numbing your fingers until you couldn't feel the hilt of your dagger, or the summer sun baked you in your heavy wool layers until you were dizzy from dehydration. You were hungry, constantly, because you had to ration the moldy bread and hard cheese you brought with you, eating tiny amounts to make it last. And you were thirsty because water bladders leak and refills are impossible when you're hiding in hostile territory. This physical degradation meant that by the time the moment of action finally arrived, you weren't a coiled spring of athletic potential. You were a stiff, shivering, starving wreck of a human being who had to summon one last burst of desperate energy to do the deed before collapsing or fleeing. We also need to talk about the immense difficulty of information gathering in a world without photographs, GPS, or the internet, where identifying your target was a logistical nightmare that often led to tragic and dangerous cases of mistaken identity. You might be hired to kill Lord Percival, but you've never seen Lord Percival, and the only description you have is that he is tall, has a beard, and usually wears a red cloak, a description that matches half the men in the castle garrison, and probably the visiting merchant as well. You had to rely on eavesdropping in taverns, bribing loose-lipped servants with coin you barely had, or lurking near the chapel to see who sat in the Lord's pew, all while trying not to look like a stranger asking suspicious questions in a village where everyone is related and outsiders are viewed with intense hostility. This ambiguity led to botched jobs where the assassin killed the wrong brother, the steward, or a guest, creating a chaotic aftermath where the actual target is now alerted and on high alert, while the employer is furious and refusing to pay for the incompetence. Dealing with the fallout of a botched job was arguably more dangerous than the mission itself, because now you have two powerful enemies: the target who is hunting you down with dogs and soldiers, and the employer who sees you as a loose end that needs to be tied up before you can be captured and tortured into confessing who hired you. This squeezed the assassin into a deadly vice, forcing them to flee the region entirely,
changing their name and abandoning whatever meager life they had built, effectively becoming a refugee in their own country.
Let's examine the specific horror of the poisoner's anxiety, because while poisoning seems like the coward's way out or the easy method, it was actually a nerve-wracking game of Russian roulette played with unreliable substances and unpredictable timelines.
If you managed to slip arsenic or hemlock into a goblet, you couldn't just leave.
You often had to stay in the room, posing as a servant or guest, watching the target drink it and waiting for the effects to kick in, praying that the dose was high enough to kill, but low enough not to cause immediate,
Violent vomiting that would give the game away before the target expired.
You had to maintain a poker face while the victim complained of a stomachache, watching the panic rise in the room, knowing that if the castle physician arrived and smelled the distinctive almond scent of cyanide or recognized the symptoms of belladonna,
the doors would be barred and everyone inside would be searched and questioned under duress.
Furthermore, obtaining these poisons was a crime in itself, requiring transactions with shady apothecaries or head witches who could easily blackmail you later or sell you harmless colored water just to make a quick profit,
leaving you standing there like a fool while your target finishes his wine and feels perfectly fine.
The chemical instability of medieval poisons meant they could lose potency if stored incorrectly or react badly with certain foods, leading to scenarios where the target merely gets sick, recovers, and then begins a ruthless purge of his household to find the culprit. Being a poisoner required a knowledge of chemistry that most uneducated thugs didn't possess,
making it a specialized and incredibly high-risk branch of the profession that often ended with the poisoner being forced to taste their own wares to prove their innocence, a test that obviously had a very low survival rate. There is also the terrifying reality of the double cross, which was practically an industry standard in the world of medieval assassination, because the person who hires you is already demonstrating that they are willing to use murder to solve their problems. So why would they treat you any differently?
It was cheaper and safer for a noble to hire an assassin, wait for the deed to be done, and then have his own guards ambush the assassin at the payment meeting, thereby removing the only witness to the crime and saving the cost of the contract in one stroke.
Experienced assassins knew this and treated every meeting with a client as a potential ambush, insisting on public meeting places, using intermediaries, or setting up elaborate dead drops for payment. But even with these precautions,
the life expectancy of a man who knew a king's dirty secrets was measured in weeks, not years.
You were essentially a disposable tool, a human arrow fired at a target, and once you hit or missed you were useless and dangerous to keep around, a reality that stripped away any sense of loyalty or pride in the work.
You weren't serving a greater good or a noble cause.
You were a temporary inconvenience to be used and discarded, a smudge on the history of a great house that would be wiped clean the moment you served your purpose. This profound isolation meant that you could never truly relax, never truly celebrate a success, because success just meant you had moved one step closer to becoming a liability that needed to be erased. Consider the impact of this life on the human body, specifically the assassin's gait, and the physical toll of chronic stealth, which sounds like a cool fantasy trope, but in reality was a collection of debilitating joint issues caused by constantly crouching, climbing, and moving in unnatural ways to avoid making noise. Years of creeping through damp corridors and freezing nights gave these men premature arthritis, chronic back pain, and a permanent hunch, making them physically distinct and often painful to watch as they aged. You weren't a lithe, acrobatic dancer. You were a stiff, aching vessel of pain who had to pop joints and rub salve on swollen knees just to get moving in the morning, battling a body that was actively failing under the stress of the profession. Finally, we must strip away the romance of the lone wolf and look at the crippling loneliness that defined this existence, a silence so profound it could drive men to madness.
You couldn't share your burdens, you couldn't boast of your victories, and you couldn't seek comfort in the arms of a spouse without risking their life. So you existed in a bubble of secrecy that separated you from the rest of the human race.
You watched normal people living their lives baking bread, raising children, laughing in taverns through a pane of glass, knowing you could never join them, because you were the monster in their stories, the shadow they feared, and the darkness that would eventually consume you whole.
We need to shift our focus to the perfect crime of the Middle Ages, the assassination that wasn't supposed to look like an assassination at all, but rather the ubiquitous and politically convenient hunting accident.
a method so popular among the treacherous nobility that going on a hunt with a rival was essentially signing a waiver for your own death.
While stabbing someone in their bed sends a message, it also starts a war, so the smart assassin, or rather, the hired hand masked as a fellow huntsman specialized in the chaotic, violent environment of the chase, where arrows flew wildly. Horses panicked,
and men were frequently gored by boars or trampled in the mud.
Your job here wasn't to be a ninja. It was to be the guy who accidentally loosed a crossbow bolt into the Duke's back when he was distracted by a stag, or the one who spooked his horse as it approached a ravine, ensuring a fatal fall that could be blamed on the unpredictable nature of the beast rather than the malice of man. This type of work required a completely different skill set than the alleyway stabber. You had to be a competent rider, a skilled marksman, and an exceptional actor capable of feigning horror and grief over the tragic mishap you had just orchestrated, screaming for help while secretly checking for a pulse to ensure the job was finished. The forest was the perfect accomplice, a place of shadows, uneven ground, and limited visibility where witnesses were confused and the adrenaline of the hunt masked the cold calculation of murder, allowing dynasties to change hands without a single formal accusation being levied. However, the risk was astronomical because if anyone saw you aim that bolt, or noticed the cut in the saddle girth that caused the fall, you wouldn't just be executed.
You would be hunted down by the entire hunting party right there in the woods, turning the predator into the prey in a matter of seconds.
Let's dismantle the Hollywood trope of the femme fatale, the leather-clad, dagger-wielding seductress who infiltrates the castle, seduces the king, and kills him in a moment of passion, because the reality of female assassins in the Middle Ages was far more subtle, far more desperate, and entirely devoid of the sexualized agency fiction grants them. Women were indeed used as instruments of death, but they were almost exclusively employed in the domestic sphere as poisoners or saboteurs, usually invisible servants, washerwomen, or overlooked concubines who had access to the food, the clothing, and the bedchambers that no armed man could ever reach.
These women were often coerced into the role, threatened with the death of their children or the destruction of their families, if they didn't slip the powder into the wine or leave the parson gate unlocked for the actual killers to enter.
There was no glamour in this.
It was a terrifying existence of silent, trembling compliance where the woman had to act completely normal while carrying the weight of impending treason, knowing that if she was caught, the misogynistic legal system of the era would visit upon her punishments even more grotesque than those reserved for men, often involving burning at the stake as a witch or an unnatural monster.
The Black Widow figure existed, but she wasn't a sleek operative. She was usually a desperate wife trapped in an abusive marriage or a political pawn moved across the board by powerful men, using the only weapon available to her the trust placed in her by the victim to end a life,
often resulting in her own destruction when she was inevitably scapegoated by the very men who hired her.
We must also consider the architectural hostility you faced,
because castles were not just piles of stone.
They were intricate machines designed specifically to murder intruders like you, filled with subtle, passive defenses that could break your neck before you even saw a guard.
Consider the trip step, a single stair in a spiral staircase built slightly higher or lower than the rest, designed to disrupt the rhythm of a person running up them in the dark, causing them to trip and fall, creating a noise that alerted the garrison.
You were fighting the building itself, navigating spiral staircases that wound clockwise to give the defending swordsman the advantage of the central pillar while forcing you, the attacker, to expose your body to swing your weapon, a design choice that turned every ascent into a tactical nightmare.
Floors were often covered in dry rushes or straw that crunched loudly underfoot, making silent movement nearly impossible, or in some cases, murder holes in the ceiling of corridors allowed defenders to drop heavy stones or pour scalding water on anyone attempting to sneak through the passageways. You weren't just sneaking past people.
You were navigating a hostile obstacle course where the very ground you walked on was weaponized against you, forcing you to move with an agonizing slowness that stretched your nerves to the breaking point. Even the doors were heavy, reinforced oak bound with iron, often barring from the inside, meaning that if you picked a lock, you might still be physically unable to open the door without creating a massive, echoing thud that would wake the dead.
Let's talk about the animal kingdom, specifically the unsung heroes of castle security that were the bane of every medieval assassin's existence. Not the warhorses or the hunting hounds, but the geese and the peacocks.
You might laugh, But geese are incredibly territorial, aggressive, and loud, creating a deafening honking racket the moment anything strange enters their vicinity, making them more effective than a sleeping guard and impossible to bribe with a piece of steak.
Peacocks, kept by the wealthy as status symbols, possess a piercing, high-pitched scream that sounds like a woman being murdered, a noise that would shatter the silence of the night and send the entire household into a panic if you accidentally startled one in the gardens.
And then, of course, there were the dogs, not the pampered pets of today, but massive, scarred mastiffs and wolfhounds trained to kill wolves and men alike, allowed to roam the castle grounds at night specifically to tear intruders apart. You couldn't fight 3 mastiffs in the dark with a dagger. Your only option was to smell like nothing, make no sound, and pray the wind didn't carry your scent, or to bring meat laced with sleeping draughts and hope the dogs were hungry enough to eat it before they barked.
Dealing with animals added a layer of unpredictability that no amount of planning could account for, turning a perfectly executed infiltration into a chaotic scramble for the wall, because a goose decided to wake up at the wrong moment.
We have to address the taboo of the sanctuary kill, the assassination carried out within the walls of a church or cathedral.
A desperate and blasphemous act that happened more often than history likes to admit, because the church was often the only place a target would let their guard down. In a world where violence was omnipresent, the church offered the concept of sanctuary, a divine protection that theoretically forbade bloodshed on holy ground, leading paranoid targets to practically live in the cathedral, sleeping near the altar and eating their meals in the vestry to avoid the blade. For the assassin, this presented a terrible moral and tactical dilemma. To kill a man in a church was to incur the wrath of God and the immediate excommunication of the Pope, ensuring not just death, but eternal damnation and total social ostracization. Yet, contracts were still issued, and assassins still took them, disguising themselves as monks or pilgrims, hiding daggers in prayer books, and striking while the victim was kneeling in prayer. A moment of ultimate vulnerability that was also the ultimate sacrilege.
The aftermath of a church killing was always hysterical mob violence. The doors would be barred, and the congregation would often tear the assassin to pieces right there in the nave, driven by a religious fury that superseded any fear of the weapon. There was no escaping a sanctuary kill. It was almost always a suicide mission, accepted only by fanatics or men who believed they were already damned, marking a moment where the desperation of politics crushed the deepest held spiritual beliefs of the age. Let's analyze the psychological siege you inflicted on a target without ever touching them. A tactic used when the physical defenses were too strong to penetrate, designed to degrade the victim's mind until they made a fatal mistake. This involved a campaign of terror, leaving a dead rat on their pillow, scratching a mark on their bedroom door while they slept, or poisoning their favorite horse, acts that proved you could get close, that you were watching, and that you could strike at any moment. The goal was to destroy their sleep, to make them doubt their own cards, and to drive them into a state of paranoia where they started firing loyal servants, changing their routine erratically,
and eventually fleeing the safety of their fortress in a blind panic, which is exactly when you would strike.
This was a cruel, slow torture that required immense patience and sadism, watching a powerful lord disintegrate into a shivering wreck who refused to eat or sleep, essentially haunting them while they were still alive. However, this required you to live in the shadows of their life for weeks, constantly risking exposure to place the terror tokens, existing as a phantom in the periphery of their vision.
A dangerous game where one slip up meant you would be the one tortured to death to relieve the target's anxiety.
We must also consider the crowd kill, the absolute antithesis of the silent night murder, where the assassin used the chaotic, crushing density of a medieval market, festival, or procession to mask the act. This was the needle in a haystack approach, where you would push through the throng, getting close enough to the target to drive a thin stiletto into their kidney or under the ribs,
and then rely on the sheer pressure of the crowd to hold the body up for a few seconds while you slipped away into the mass of humanity. It required nerves of steel and the ability to act completely casual while covered in blood, blending instantly into the flow of peasants, merchants, and beggars, becoming just another face in the mob.
The danger here was the mob mentality. If someone shouted "assassin" or pointed you out, the crowd would turn instantly from a shield into a weapon, swarming you, beating you, and holding you down until the guards arrived.
You were relying on the apathy and confusion of strangers for your survival, a gamble that often failed if the victim screamed, or if he was spotted by a sharp-eyed bodyguard who wasn't distracted by the jugglers or the market stalls.
This method was messy, public, and terrified the authorities because it proved that no one was safe, not even in the midst of their own people, leading to brutal crackdowns and indiscriminate arrests in the aftermath.
Finally, let's touch on the legacy of the blade, the lingering impact on the assassin's soul, if they manage to survive long enough to have one. We are talking about a form of PTSD that had no name in the Middle Ages, a soldier's heart, amplified by the solitary, dishonorable nature of the work. Historical accounts and court confessions from captured assassins often reveal men who were deeply broken, plagued by nightmares, unable to integrate into society, and obsessed with the faces of the men they killed. They speak of ghosts following them, of an inability to wash the blood from their hands no matter how much they scrubbed, a psychological manifestation of guilt in a deeply religious era.
There was no redemption for them, no veterans' hospital, only the bottle and the dark corners of the world where they waited for the inevitable retribution.
They became the bogeymen of their own lives, feared by others and loathed by themselves, living proof that the act of taking a life for coin takes a piece of the killer that can never be replaced.
The glamour of the assassin is a modern invention. The reality was a man staring at a door in a cheap room, waiting for it to open, knowing that when death finally came for him, it would wear a face very much like his own.
This concludes the deep dive into the brutal, unglamorous, and terrifying reality of the medieval assassin, a profession of desperation, filth, and blood that has been romanticized beyond recognition, but whose true history serves as a stark reminder of the brutality of the past. We must now turn our attention to the legal and political dimensions of this dark trade, which often meant that you weren't simply committing a felony when you took a nobleman's life. You were committing an act of high treason against the established feudal order, meaning that if you were captured, your fate was not a quick hanging, but an agonizing, performative execution designed by the state to demonstrate the horrific consequence of striking at the sovereign class.
The severity of the punishment was directly proportional to the rank of your victim, and for killing a high noble or, God forbid, a royal figure, you were condemned to a specialized, agonizing death that transcended mere execution, such as being drawn and quartered, where your internal organs were slowly removed while you were still alive, followed by the hacking of your body into 4 pieces to be displayed across the kingdom as a deterrent. This reality meant that every job was a binary choice, perfect success and survival, or a descent into a public horror show that stripped you of all dignity and provided the ultimate, non-negotiable end to your career. This heightened risk necessarily spawned a specialized counter-profession, the bounty hunter or professional tracker, who served as the assassin's mirror image and ultimate, relentless enemy, possessing a specialized skill set dedicated entirely to reading the landscape and anticipating the movements of a man on the run. These trackers were often former soldiers, foresters, or men hardened by years of border warfare, who knew how to distinguish the faint, intentional hoofprints of a fleeing man from the normal travel marks of a peasant. Understanding the assassin's need for isolation and anticipating the limited routes available across the feudal terrain, they didn't rely on modern forensics.
They relied on the primitive science of observation, using informants in distant taverns, questioning every ferryman at every river crossing, and reading the subtle signs of disturbed undergrowth or the absence of a proper burial site to narrow the scope of the search across a wide, unforgiving wilderness. The chase often led to the maritime edges of the continent, forcing the assassin to utilize rivers, canals, or crowded seaports as potential escape routes, places that were simultaneously lifelines and deadly traps. Hiding on a ship bound for the continent seemed like salvation. But maritime law was brutal. Captains were easily bribed by official warrants, and crowded port cities were hives of foreign spies and opportunistic thieves who could easily identify and sell out a known fugitive for a handful of coins.
You might successfully bribe your way onto a crowded cork destined for Flanders, only to find yourself confined below deck in the suffocating darkness for weeks, praying that a storm didn't wreck the vessel, or that the crew didn't turn on you during the voyage, a continuous,
claustrophobic stress that was the price of temporary freedom from the mainland guards.
Sometimes the goal of the client was the assassination of property or reputation, a specialized form of sabotage that was less risky but equally destructive to a rival's power base.
You might be hired not to stab the merchant lord, but to burn down his entire grain warehouse the night before the market, thereby collapsing his credit and starving his customers, achieving political ruin without shedding a single drop of noble blood. Or your job might be the kidnapping of a minor heir, snatching a noble child and spiriting them away to a remote convent or fortress, ensuring that the bloodline of your client's rival was disrupted without the messy, final consequence of murder, creating a long-term problem that could take decades of political negotiation to unravel.
Furthermore, not every job demanded a life. Sometimes the goal of the client was the assassination of property or reputation, a specialized form of sabotage that was less risky but equally destructive to a rival's power base.
You might be hired not to stab the merchant lord, but to burn down his entire grain warehouse the night before the market, thereby collapsing his credit and starving his customers, achieving political ruin without shedding a single drop of noble blood. Or your job might be the kidnapping of a minor heir, snatching a noble child and spiriting them away to a remote convent or fortress, ensuring that the bloodline of your client's rival was disrupted without the messy, final consequence of murder,
creating a long-term problem that could take decades of political negotiation to unravel. This type of non-lethal task required patience and technical skill over outright savagery, demanding that you be a master of locks, ropes, and distraction, specializing in silent entry and long-distance travel while managing a terrified, screaming child, often with fewer resources and less direct support than a full murder contract.
The reward was typically lower, but the chance of survival was slightly higher, provided you didn't accidentally kill the heir while transporting them, transforming a kidnapping charge into the capital crime of treason and sealing your fate regardless.
We must also acknowledge the immense invisible cost of plausible deniability, which the client paid for to ensure the killing looked like anything but an assassination, and which accounted for a massive portion of the contract price.
This deniability required an expensive network of corruption, bribing the local coroner to rule the death a stroke, paying the town guard to lose the evidence of the struggle, and funneling money to the victim's own servants to ensure they gave confusing testimony about the events leading up to the demise.
You were simply the tool.
The money went to the cleanup, the propaganda, and the systemic corruption of the local institutions necessary to ensure that the official record stated, unequivocally, that Lord Edmund died from a sudden, unforeseen internal affliction and not from a dagger to the back paid for by his cousin.
The technology of tracking relied entirely on these unreliable, corruptible human networks because there was no fingerprint analysis, no blood typing, and no reliable ballistics to connect the weapon to the crime. The tracker relied on the informant, the bitter, drunken man who heard the contract whispered in a tavern, or the greedy guard who was willing to sell the details of the investigation for half a day's pay, meaning that the stability of your freedom was always dependent on the moral failure of the people around you.
You weren't fighting science.
You were fighting gossip and greed, and since both are endemic to the human condition, your capture was always a matter of time and high enough bribery.
The final, psychological dimension of this continuous deception was the erosion of identity itself, because to survive, the assassin had to shed names and personas with the frequency of a snake shedding its skin, becoming Brother Thomas the monk one month, and Sharks the traveling tinker the next,
always wearing a mask that was not their own. This constant, high-stakes role-playing destroyed any sense of self, leaving you fundamentally unsure of who you truly were beneath the layers of grime and lies, making intimacy impossible and solitude unbearable. You became an empty vessel, defined only by the last persona you wore and the next target you were paid to eliminate, a ghost existing entirely outside the comforting, stable structures of medieval society.
The cost of being a footnote in history, a weapon without a cause, and a person without a name, far outweighed the meager handful of silver coins you received, leaving you a living shadow who simply delayed the inevitable moment when the next shadow, the tracker, the client's guards, or the hangman finally caught up to claim the debt.
We must now descend into the specific, localized hell of urban infiltration, realizing that slipping into a sprawling city like London, Paris, or Florence presented a unique and distinct set of dangers that differed completely from sneaking into an isolated stone castle,
demanding an almost theatrical mastery of the social landscape.
In the city, your greatest enemy was at the moat or the sentinel. It was the sheer density of humanity, the constant movement, the noise, and the profound lack of darkness created by thousands of smoky tallow lamps and open braziers, forcing you to utilize the chaos itself as your camouflage.
You had to master the art of the purposeful loiter, appearing to have a legitimate reason for being in every shadowed doorway or alley mouth, knowing that the wrong posture, the wrong clothes, or the wrong accent could attract the immediate, hostile attention of the watchman or worse, the hyper-vigilant local neighborhood guild who policed their own streets ruthlessly.
The architecture of the medieval city was itself a profound hazard, built almost entirely from timber and wattle and daub, resulting in a terrifyingly combustible environment that meant every open flame was a potential disaster, a threat that an assassin often utilized but feared equally.
You might be hired to burn down a rival's guild hall, a tactic that required setting a fire in a specific, hard-to-reach area where the blaze would spread quickly, but doing so meant risking the immediate, rapid conflagration of the entire district, trapping you in a sudden,
inescapable inferno of your own making.
The fear of being consumed by fire, a particularly agonizing and public death, was a constant psychological pressure that underlay every action taken in the city streets, a primitive horror that no amount of silver could truly mitigate.
This proximity to uncontrolled fire was also a tactical problem for the silent operative, because the ambient noise of a medieval city was not just chatter. It was the constant, low-level crackling and spitting of flame, the clang of the blacksmith's forge, and the continuous roar of wood fires, noises that would mask the delicate sound of a lock being pegged or a footstep on dry wood, but which also created sudden,
flickering bursts of light that could instantly reveal your presence. You had to time your movements not just around the guards' patrols, but around the unpredictable moments when a tavern door opened, casting a sudden shaft of bright, revealing light across the narrow, muddy street where you were hiding. Furthermore, sanitation in the city was an acute issue that posed a physical threat to the assassin utilizing the low ground for infiltration, as the urban landscape was a maze of open sewers, overflowing cesspits,
and refuse heaps that were not only disease-ridden but also highly flammable due to the combination of methane gas and discarded oils. Crawling through the city's underbelly meant continuous, direct exposure to typhus, dysentery, and cholera, ensuring that you were always fighting off a low-grade illness that weakened your focus and stamina, transforming a simple cough or stomach cramp into a potential liability that could compromise the entire mission. The cost of blending into the city's crime was measured in chronic infection, a slow biological assault that made peak physical performance nearly impossible. We must also consider the specialization of siege warfare applied to assassination, particularly when dealing with targets in high status, independent towers or walled town sections that were essentially miniature fortresses, requiring an operational shift from stealth to sabotage against structural integrity. Sometimes the most effective way to kill a paranoid lord was not to stab him, but to convince him the very ground he stood on was about to collapse, requiring the assassin to possess a basic understanding of masonry, load-bearing walls, and the principles of undermining. Your job might involve days spent in the sewer systems beneath a section of a wall, not to enter, but to carefully chip away at the foundation stones, creating a structural weakness that would cause a collapse during the next heavy storm or siege. Ensuring the target's death was ruled an act of God or military misfortune. This requires immense physical stamina, the ability to work in total darkness while inhaling toxic air, and the deep, pervasive fear of being crushed alive by thousands of pounds of stone, a claustrophobic terror that few men could endure. It was a trade of patience, where the political goal was achieved weeks later by remote cause, rather than immediate effect, and the assassin's only reward was the distant rumor that the tower had finally suffered a catastrophic foundation failure. The acquisition of specialized non-lethal gear in the city was another logistical headache that amplified the danger, because buying common tools like ropes and hammers was easy, but purchasing items that indicated malice, such as specialized climbing spikes, potent sleeping drafts,
or custom-filed lockpicks, required dealing with the absolute worst elements of the urban underworld.
You were forced to transact with fence masters, black market apothecaries, and renegade engineers who knew exactly what you were planning and who saw you not as a customer, but as a future blackmail target, ensuring that every piece of specialized gear came with a high price tag and an even higher risk of exposure. The paranoia of the client also extended to the very tools used, often requiring the assassin to abandon or destroy all specialized equipment immediately after the job to prevent any forensic link back to the source of the murder, meaning that you were constantly sinking vast amounts of silver into tools that were used once and then discarded into a river or melted down in a clandestine forge. This added further financial strain and complexity to an already impossible economy, reinforcing the notion that the assassin's life was one of continuous, destructive consumption where nothing could be kept and everything was disposable, including your own life.
Finally, we must consider the logistics of the waiting game within the tight confines of the city, where finding a secure, long-term hideout was a near impossible task that drove the price of rent to absurd heights. You couldn't afford a whole house, and you couldn't stay long in a legitimate inn, so you were forced to rely on the kindness, or more accurately, the greed of the city's subterranean economy, paying exorbitant fees to sleep in damp cellars, beneath the floorboards of abandoned workshops, or within the labyrinthine warrens of the city's shanty towns. These safe houses were anything but safe, often being shared with other criminals, infested with disease and subject to periodic, violent raids by the city watch, who knew these areas were breeding grounds for trouble, ensuring that you lived a life of constant motion and transient fear,
never truly sleeping more than a few hours in one location before the mounting danger forced you to move on again.
This continuous displacement stripped the assassin of any semblance of normalcy or comfort, reinforcing the fundamental, unglamorous reality that the profession was less about skillful killing and more about the desperate, exhausting struggle for a few hours of undetected rest in a world designed to crush you.
The urban environment was not a playground for shadows. It was a cage of noise, fire, and contagious disease, a labyrinth where every corner held a potential witness or a watchful guard.
Even the moment of reward was profoundly poisoned, because receiving your payment meant grappling with the sheer, impractical bulk of medieval currency, often a heavy sack of diverse silver coins.
Each piece requiring meticulous inspection to ensure your unscrupulous client had not replaced genuine currency with leaden counterfeits that would render your entire payment worthless the moment you tried to spend it.
These coins were often irregular in weight and purity, demanding a trip to a money changer or a guild official just to verify their value. A public transaction that automatically drew unwanted attention from tax collectors, rival merchants, and opportunistic thugs who knew exactly what kind of desperation it took to acquire such a sudden, untraceable influx of wealth. You were constantly faced with the dilemma of either spending a large sum quickly, which guaranteed suspicion and inquiries into your immediate past, or carrying the heavy, telltale weight of your portable treasury everywhere you went.
Knowing that the sack of silver was both your salvation and the most effective physical signal of your dangerous profession. This currency problem often forced the assassin to resort to the primitive economy of bartering for safety, using their few legitimate coins to purchase feathers, silence, and transient loyalty from the lowest strata of society, essentially paying for the right to exist undetected in the shadows.
You weren't paying for goods, you were paying the local beggar to look the other way, the tavern owner to forget your face, and the gate guard to suffer a sudden, momentary fit of blindness as you slipped out of the city,
draining your meager wealth in a continuous stream of harsh money that made true, sustained financial independence impossible. The coin was never a foundation upon which to build a life.
It was fuel to keep the machine running for one more week, or one more desperate escape. We must now confront the ultimate, unglamorous end that awaited most assassins who were caught, the medieval interrogation. A process whose sole purpose was not to confirm your guilt which was assumed, but to find out who paid you, turning your body into a tool of political revelation.
The terror of the torture chamber was absolute, stripped of all the cinematic bravery, leaving only the chilling certainty that your breaking point was not a matter of willpower but a question of time, pressure, and the specific application of devices designed to inflict maximum pain without immediate death.
You were confronting state-sanctioned professionals who had hours or even days to work on you. Specialists who knew the exact sequence of escalating pain required to shatter human resistance, often starting with the slow crushing of fingers, or the excruciating stretching of limbs before moving to instruments that defied description.
The profound horror of this experience lies in the fact that your confession was almost guaranteed, meaning that every assassin knew that if they were captured, they would eventually betray their client, their friends, and every secret they possessed. making loyalty a tragically meaningless concept in the face of medieval cruelty.
The client knew this too, which is precisely why they insisted on the double cross and the immediate disposal of the assassin after the job, realizing that a dead killer tells no tales, but a living killer, no matter how tough, is a walking, ticking political time bomb just waiting for the pressure to be applied. Your only hope in that room was a quick death, often sought desperately by cursing the king or screaming a confession early, a final unheroic act of self-preservation to bypass the agonizing performance required by the executioner.
This inevitable betrayal meant that the assassin's immediate circle of associates, the fence who bought his stolen goods, the woman who patched his clothes, or the low-level criminal who provided his aliases, were the most likely sources of his capture, not the powerful lords he was hired to kill.
The authorities didn't waste time hunting the forests. They simply arrested the assassin's known associates and applied pressure until one of them, fearing the same horrific fate, sold the killer out for a reduced sentence or a handful of silver, confirming the assassin's deep, pervasive distrust that no one, not even those who briefly helped him, could ever be trusted. The political aftermath of an assassination, particularly in a large city, often required the local authorities to perform a necessary public show of competence by finding a culprit quickly, leading to the routine use of the institutional scapegoat.
If the true client, a duke or a rival merchant, could not be implicated without shattering the social order, the government would often arrest and torture a marginalized figure, a foreign vagrant, a known thief, or, tragically, a member of a persecuted ethnic group like the Jewish community, force a confession out of them, and execute them publicly to satisfy the mob's desire for swift justice.
This brutal reality meant that the assassin's act of political murder resulted in the death of an innocent man who was already vulnerable, adding another layer of silent, systemic injustice to the blood on the killer's hands.
Finally, we must consider the utter fragility of the plan when subjected to the simple, uncaring forces of the natural world, realizing that no amount of meticulous planning could account for the sheer unpredictability of medieval weather.
A sudden, torrential downpour could instantly wash away the meticulous footprints you relied on for your escape, but it could also ruin the sensitive powder of the poison you were carrying, or soak the dry thatch roof you planned to ignite,
causing a catastrophic failure in the middle of the operation.
Conversely, a sudden, unexpected heatwave could make your heavy wool disguise unbearable, forcing you to shed layers and risk exposure, or a dense, unseasonal fog could shroud the castle, making it impossible to see the guard's patrol pattern you had spent days memorizing.
The sophisticated, intricate clockwork of the perfect assassination was almost always disrupted by variables as simple and cruel as a sudden gust of wind or an untimely drop in temperature, reinforcing the deep, unglamorous truth that the medieval assassin was not a master of fate, but a pathetic servant to the elements.
This life was a high-speed collision course with death, driven by poverty, sustained by fear, and ended almost universally in betrayal or a public execution.
The romance of the assassin vanishes entirely when confronted with the grime, the paranoia, and the inevitable reality of the iron tools waiting in the dark. We now turn to the macro-level political and social constraints that fundamentally limited the use of assassination as an everyday tool of power, realizing that despite its perceived effectiveness, it was unpredictable geopolitical risks for the client. The greatest danger in commissioning a murder was the unintended consequence, particularly if the victim was a minor but well-connected noble whose powerful relatives saw the death as an immediate casus belli requiring massive, bloody retribution.
Assassination wasn't a precision strike.
It was often a grenade thrown into a crowded political field, and the client often found that the temporary relief of a rival's death was quickly overshadowed by the sudden, overwhelming problem of dealing with the victim's enraged family and their allied mercenary armies. The medieval concept of feudal loyalty and vengeance was a powerful, self-sustaining force, meaning that a killing was never truly over. It initiated a blood debt that could span generations, forcing the client to live in continuous, acute fear of reciprocal violence from the victim's sons, brothers, or even distant cousins who were bound by honor to seek vengeance.
This fear of future, unending retribution often meant that prudent rulers preferred long, drawn-out legal battles, political maneuvering, or even direct, open warfare which provided defined rules, winners and losers over the endless, paranoid cycle of mutual, shadow realm killings. The assassin's job, in this context, was simply a trigger for decades of future, formalized violence. A high price to pay for a moment of political advantage.
A major limiting factor was the difficulty of communication and verification across the immense distances of the feudal landscape, because arranging a contract required a long, dangerous paper trail of intermediaries, coded letters, and whispered meetings that created far too many vulnerable points for the client.
Every letter carried by a courier was a potential piece of evidence. Every intermediary was a potential blackmailer. And every delay in communication meant the target might move, the political landscape might shift, or the assassin might simply take the advance payment and disappear,
forcing the client to commit a second act of violence just to clean up the fallout of the first.
The very act of coordinating a murder over 100 miles was an administrative nightmare that few rulers were willing to risk, unless their own life or kingdom was hanging in the balance.
Furthermore, the cost of absolute secrecy was astronomical, far exceeding the assassin's meager fee, because the client had to continuously fund the counterintelligence effort to keep the assassination from being traced back to them years after the fact. This meant paying spies within the victim's family, funding corrupt officials to block further investigation, and ensuring the continued silence of every single person who knew the assassin's name or even the color of the purse that was passed across the table, an endless,
exhausting financial drain that often required more resources than simply defeating the rival in battle. The murder itself was cheap.
The sustained, lifelong effort to prevent your own execution for treason was ruinously expensive. The specific social context of the target also dictated the feasibility of the job, because killing a powerful, well-loved church official often carried a far greater political risk than killing a universally hated nobleman. Attacking the clergy risked the immediate, powerful intervention of the papacy, which could impose and interdict a complete shutdown of all religious services across the client's lands, turning the entire population against the client in a terrible, unified wave of religious panic and resentment.
Conversely, killing a merchant or a city official, while still illegal, carried a localized and financial risk that was much easier to contain than the ecclesiastical outrage provoked by shedding holy blood.
The assassin also had to contend with the subtle, insidious weapon of court politics and the constant presence of the spy network that pervaded every major feudal court, where official and unofficial agents monitored every visitor, every strange coin, and every whispered grievance.
Every court maintained a web of informants, from chambermaids to stable boys, who sold information about movement and routine to any faction willing to pay, making the simple act of observation, which was the assassin's most necessary preparatory task, an incredibly dangerous game of being watched while you watched.
The assassin often found that the information they needed was sold to them by the victim's own spy network, who was simultaneously using the sale as bait to lure the killer into a trap. Finally, the moral and religious constraints on the client, even the most ruthless noble, often served as a significant brake on the free use of murder, because the fear of eternal damnation was a real, tangible threat in the medieval mind. While many nobles ignored the church's moral dictates, the public and private knowledge that they had commissioned a mortal sin which required deep penance, confession, and massive payments to the church to absolve was a deterrent that few took lightly. The assassination not only endangered the body politic, it deeply endangered the client's soul, forcing many to spend their final years in agonizing fear, donating vast tracts of land and gold to monasteries in a desperate, last-minute attempt to buy forgiveness for the violence they had paid for. The assassin's work often resulted in the client dying poor, terrified, and convinced of his own damnation, a final, fitting irony to a life built on betrayal. The continuous, grueling requirement for long-term stealth and undetected movement necessitated a brutal, self-imposed training regimen that was far from the dramatic swordplay seen in fiction, focusing instead on the monotonous, exhausting mastery of the body's internal functions and the absolute control of unintentional noise. You had to teach yourself how to walk without transferring weight to the heel, relying only on the balls and edges of the feet to minimize vibration and ground contact noise, an exercise that caused continuous, debilitating strain on the muscles of the ankles and calves,
ensuring that every step you took was a small act of physical suffering.
Furthermore, the assassin needed to master the unnatural skill of breathing without sound and controlling the urge to cough, sneeze, or clear the throat,
realizing that the smallest involuntary bodily function could instantly betray your presence in the dead quiet of a castle hallway.
Often leading to moments where you held your breath until you were dizzy with oxygen deprivation, risking unconsciousness just to avoid making a sound. This self-imposed physical discipline extended to the necessity of enduring discomfort without flinching, training yourself to ignore the pain of freezing cold, insect bites, muscle cramps, and the continuous internal dialogue screaming for rest, because any visible reaction or sudden movement could be the clue that exposes your location. The assassin's body was treated as a tool to be suppressed, forcing the man to exist in a state of minimal biological function for hours at a time, a psychological and physiological pressure that fundamentally broke down the body's natural resilience and contributed to the premature aging and chronic illness common among those who survived the trade for any length of time. We must also explore the necessity of mastering the enemy's routine, a form of meticulous behavioral profiling that involves spending days observing the minutiae of the target's life until you could predict their movements with terrifying accuracy. Realizing that the success of the mission often rested on the subtle predictability of human habit, this meant learning not just when the guard patrols changed, but how the sleepy midnight guard carried his lantern, the specific creak of the floorboard outside the victim's chamber, or the exact hour the drunken cook stumbled out to the privy, transforming the target's household schedule into a detailed, usable blueprint for infiltration. This task was itself a form of self-torture, forcing the assassin to stare fixedly at the same window or corridor for interminable stretches, fighting the mental exhaustion and the sensory deprivation that threatened to break their concentration.
The psychological consequence of this relentless surveillance was the collapse of the assassin's own psychological defenses, as the continuous observation of human behavior from a detached, critical distance often led to a profound, crippling sense of disconnection and nihilism. Seeing nobles commit petty hypocrisies, watching servants betray their masters for a coin, and realizing that the lives you were risking yours to take were often mundane and unremarkable, stripped the entire enterprise of any meaning, leaving the assassin with the cold, sterile knowledge that all human life,
including his own, was utterly fungible and easily purchased. This internal emptiness made the act of killing easier, but it made the act of living infinitely harder, rendering the assassin incapable of forming genuine human attachments or finding purpose outside the execution of the contract. The assassin also had to develop a mastery of improvised tools and weapons that extended far beyond the simple dagger, requiring an acute understanding of basic physics and material science to turn everyday objects into lethal implements. This involved using a simple strip of dried leather as an effective garrote, employing a sharpened bone needle as an untraceable puncturing weapon, or utilizing a piece of heavy rope and a pulley mechanism to secure a sudden descent from a roof, transforming the clutter of the medieval world into a potential arsenal. Every visit to a blacksmith, every trip past a carpenter's shop, was a study in potential weaponry, forcing the assassin to view their environment not as a place of safety, but as a hostile landscape filled with latent tools for murder, further cementing their perpetual state of vigilance.
Finally, we must consider the specific horror of the post-kill anxiety, the immediate, crushing burden of having successfully taken a life, which in a deeply religious, superstitious era, carried the very real threat of vengeful spirits and supernatural retribution.
The assassin was not just fleeing the guards.
He was fleeing the ghost of the man he had just killed, terrified that the victim's unhallowed spirit would pursue him, leading to ritualistic behaviors, desperate, silent prayers for protection, and a deep-seated fear of shadows and sudden noises, believing them to be the movements of the vengeful dead.
This psychological terror, compounded by the constant physical exertion and lack of sleep, created a kind of waking delirium that often led to mistakes, ensuring that the act of murder carried its own immediate, self-destructive punishment.
The assassin's life was a continuous, brutal act of self-suppression, a permanent state of high alert that ultimately destroyed the person within the body, ensuring that even if they escaped the gallows, they could never truly escape the psychological and physical wreckage the job had made of them. We must now examine the specialized role of the alchemist and the apothecary within the larger political murder economy, realizing that these figures, often seen as learned healers, were in fact essential and deeply dangerous conspirators in the practice of silent killing, possessing the unique knowledge required to create undetectable poisons or powerful sleeping draughts.
The assassin rarely possessed the complex chemical understanding necessary to safely handle and deploy true toxins. They were reliant upon a network of these unscrupulous chemists who operated on the fringes of legitimate science, supplying lethal substances that could mimic the symptoms of common illnesses like fever, stomach rot, or heart failure. The apothecary was the true architect of the natural death assassination, providing the plausibility shield that the common murderer lacked. Dealing with these alchemists presented a unique set of risks for the assassin, requiring clandestine meetings in smoke-filled, suspicious workshops where the air hung heavy with the smell of sulfur and exotic herbs, and where the slightest miscommunication could result in acquiring a substance that was ineffective, or worse, toxic enough to harm the assassin himself during transit. Furthermore, these suppliers of death possessed a crippling amount of leverage over the killer, knowing the exact nature of the weapon and who was paying for it, ensuring they were the ultimate blackmailers who required continuous, secret payoffs to maintain their silence long after the victim was in the ground. The assassin was thus trapped in a perpetual state of financial dependency on the very person who provided the means of the crime, adding yet another parasitic layer to the economics of violence. The entire process of disposal of the body was itself a terrifying, unglamorous logistical challenge that often took precedence over the actual murder. Because leaving a body where it was found in the victim's chamber guaranteed a forensic investigation that would lead back to the household staff and potentially the assassin. You had to move the corpse, often a heavy, cumbersome weight, through dark, narrow passages without leaving a trail of blood, without bumping it against a wall, and without attracting the attention of sleeping servants, requiring an uncomfortable intimacy with the dead that few men could endure. The methods of disposal were rarely poetic. They involved sinking the body in a river, burying it hastily in a marshy field, or feeding it to the pigs, the ultimate insult, all tasks carried out in the dark, against the clock, under the profound fear of being discovered mid-act. This need for discreet disposal meant that many assassins specialized in weapons that minimized bleeding, such as blunt force trauma to the back of the skull or the use of garrotes that left minimal external marking, prioritizing the logistical ease of the cover-up over the theatrical drama of the knife fight. The ultimate success of the mission was often judged not by the skill of the kill, but by how long it took for the body to be found, or whether the corpse was ever found at all, transforming the assassin into a specialized, morbid sanitation engineer of political rivals. The geography of the assassin's escape was also a critical, limiting factor. Realizing that the massive mountain ranges of Europe, the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the dense forests were not places of freedom, but of grinding, debilitating hardship that few could endure for long periods. These natural barriers were patrolled by local lords and brigands, and travel through them was slow, requiring expert knowledge of mountain passes and hidden trails, forcing the fugitive to rely on expensive, unreliable local guides who themselves posed an acute risk of betrayal. Crossing the Alps in winter, for instance, turned an escape into a likely death sentence due to freezing temperatures, avalanches, and the difficulty of finding food, forcing the assassin to choose between the immediate danger of the town guard and the slow, inevitable doom of exposure in the mountains. The only reliable method of moving long distances quickly was to impersonate a member of the church or a high-status beggar, wearing the robe of a traveling friar or a pilgrim. Because religious persons were generally afforded passage and temporary sanctuary across feudal borders without the intense scrutiny given to common laborers or travelers. This disguise required a high degree of religious fluency and the ability to recite prayers, display reverence, and carry the correct identifying religious artifacts, forcing the assassin to become a master of theological pretense to survive the checkpoints. Finally, we must consider the specific social isolation of the foreign assassin. The hired killer brought in from a distant land like Italy, Bohemia, or the Byzantine Empire, who carried a unique set of vulnerabilities that were both tactical and linguistic. A foreign killer was easily identifiable by their clothing, their mannerisms, and most critically, their accent and dialect, making it impossible for them to engage in the necessary verbal deception required for blending into the local population. They were walking signals of suspicion, forcing them to rely almost entirely on sign language, written notes, and the brief, heavily mediated communication of their handler. This profound inability to speak freely made the foreign assassin highly dependent on their client, who could easily abandon them, knowing the killer had no recourse, no network,
and no ability to communicate their plight to local authorities,
ensuring that the foreign blade was the most disposable and untraceable weapon in the medieval murder arsenal. The reality of the assassin's life, therefore, was not one of glamorous, quiet competence, but of acute, unrelenting vulnerability driven by the inherent complexity and brutality of the world they sought to navigate.
We must dedicate a significant portion of our focus to the primitive yet critical technology of medieval surveillance and logistics, realizing that the assassin's success hinged on a reliable, if crude, understanding of time and distance in a world that lacked standardized measurements.
Tracking the precise movements of a patrol or the exact timing of a noble's departure was made exponentially more difficult by the fact that medieval towns and castles operated on variable time scales, using sundials, water clocks, or the chiming of a specific church bell,
meaning that every minute was interpreted differently across the landscape.
The assassin had to carry and synchronize his own crude sandglass or candle clock, maintaining a precise, isolated rhythm that conflicted with the fluid, inconsistent timekeeping of the environment, forcing him into continuous calculations and estimations that were ripe for catastrophic error. Furthermore, the technology of long-distance signaling was often the only way an assassin could confirm the successful elimination of a target to a client waiting miles away, requiring the use of complicated, PI-arranged methods that were inherently vulnerable to interception and weather. This involved elaborate smoke signals from a distant hill, requiring precise timing and specific colors of smoke to convey the outcome, or the use of trained carrier pigeons, which were themselves a luxury item, easily lost,
or intercepted by rival factions who knew to shoot any bird flying suspiciously over enemy territory.
The failure of this signal, whether due to rain, a sudden wind shift, or a hungry hawk, often led the client to assume the mission had failed, causing them to dispatch a second assassin or initiate an unplanned political move, doubling the danger and the chaos,
and reinforcing the assassin's profound lack of control over his own narrative. The essential simplicity of the tools was itself a constant source of stress, because the assassin's toolkit, the ropes, the basic lockpicks fashioned from stolen iron. The stolen daggers lacked any form of backup or failsafe, meaning a single piece of bad luck, a bent pick, or a snapped rope could instantly cascade the operation into total disaster. There were no redundant systems.
If the rope broke, you fell.
If the pick snapped, you were trapped.
If the stolen dagger chipped mid-strike, you were in a desperate fight for your life with a dull instrument.
This profound technological fragility ensured that every action taken was a high-stakes gamble against failure, a pressure that few modern professionals could comprehend, turning the simplest task of opening a door into an act of nerve-shattering difficulty.
We must also consider the existential crisis of the assassin's legacy, realizing that the ultimate end of the job was not just death, but absolute oblivion, a total erasure from the historical record that stripped the killer of any claim to memory or significance.
Unlike the soldier who died bravely in battle, or the martyr who died for faith, the assassin died in secret, in shame, or in the ultimate public degradation of the gallows, and his name was often deliberately forgotten or worse, publicly attached to a lie to protect the reputation of the client.
This professional commitment to being a ghost meant that no one recorded the assassin's origins, his true motivations, or the complex, dangerous skills he possessed, ensuring that the only lasting record of his existence was the silent, terrible hole he left in the life of his victim. The ultimate, final struggle for the medieval assassin was not against the god's sword, but against this imminent cultural and personal extinction, forcing him to live a life with no prospect of history, no chance of honor,
and no hope of a proper burial or a place in the community's memory.
The silver coin, the objective measure of the life, was a poor substitute for the soul, and the glamour of the assassin is merely a modern mythology imposed upon a reality of filth, fear, and utter, relentless insignificance. The man who lived in the shadows often died praying for the light, a final, unglamorous cry against the darkness he had both embraced and been consumed by. We must conclude this grim survey by examining how the very mythology of the assassin, even though largely fabricated by nervous nobles and sensationalizing chroniclers, became a powerful, self-sustaining tool of political control in the hands of the ruling class. The constant fear of the unseen dagger was often far more useful to the powerful than the actual deployment of the killer, serving as an invisible deterrent that maintained order and discouraged dissent. because a ruler could simply allow the rumor to circulate that he possessed access to men in the shadows, capable of silencing rivals without a trace.
This meant the assassin's most effective weapon was not the blade he carried, but the terror he inspired, a reputation that was weaponized by his employer to govern through silent intimidation. The ruling class understood that the narrative of the assassination was a political commodity, and they meticulously managed the messaging around high-profile deaths to achieve specific ends, often choosing to blame a political rival for an act of murder they themselves commissioned, or deliberately allowing the death to be misattributed to a marginalized group to fuel existing social tensions.
In this sense, the assassin was simply a narrative device, a character in a carefully crafted propaganda play designed to manipulate public opinion and maintain the status quo by channeling the mob's fear and anger away from the true perpetrators of the violence. The actual killer was merely a nameless cog in a vast machine of political theater, stripped of any agency over the interpretation of his own actions. The reality of feudal contracts and obligations also played a significant, unglamorous role in the assassin's operational risk, because every action he took was governed by the labyrinthine, archaic laws of land and fealty, a web of complex jurisdictions that often determined the feasibility of an escape. Killing a man on one side of a river might bring the wrath of a particular duke, while killing him 50 feet away might fall under the jurisdiction of an entirely different, more corruptible baron,
forcing the assassin to study arcane legal maps and boundaries as meticulously as he studied patrol routes. He had to be a part-time legal scholar just to calculate the precise level of military resistance he would face, realizing that the difference between freedom and public torture often came down to whether his escape path crossed a specific, invisible jurisdictional line. This reliance on confusing, fluid legal boundaries meant that the assassin was constantly operating in a state of legal ambiguity, never truly knowing whose law applied to him at any given moment,
and always risking the chance that the territory he believed was a safe haven was actually ruled by a blood relative of his last victim. This continuous calculation of legal risk added an immense cognitive load to an already overloaded mind, turning every road sign and every local decree into a potential harbinger of doom. Finally, the deep irony of the assassin's anonymity is the ultimate testament to the unglamorous reality of the job, because while he dedicated his life to taking the spotlight from others, he himself was destined to fade into absolute obscurity.
Forgotten by history and rejected by the religious consensus of his age. His struggle was not for fame or glory, but for a meager, temporary survival bought at the cost of his identity, his health, and his immortal soul.
The glamour is a ghost story told in the quiet of a modern room. The reality was a man shivering in a ditch, waiting for a dawn he knew might never come. We must now address the few highly specialized skills that an assassin might genuinely acquire, realizing that this training was rarely formalized in a secret temple, but was instead a brutal, self-directed curriculum acquired through necessity, desperation, and the black market of skill. An assassin couldn't openly seek instruction in silent killing, so he often paid heavily for adjacent, less suspicious training. For instance, paying a master tanner or leatherworker to teach him the art of crafting perfectly silent, soft-soled boots using specialized,
oil-tanned leather that minimized squeaking and maximized grip on stone surfaces.
This was an expensive, necessary expense, as the noisy footwear of a common soldier or peasant would betray the assassin instantly in the quiet corridors of a keep, forcing him to invest deeply in his primary interface with the hostile environment.
Similarly, the art of lockpicking was not learned from a fictional grandmaster but was slowly, painstakingly acquired by bribing disgraced blacksmiths or paying low-level thieves for a single, critical lesson and the loan of a few rudimentary rakes and tension wrenches.
This knowledge was often rudimentary, teaching the assassin only the crudest method of forcing a simple warded lock, meaning that confronting the complex, multi-layered tumblers on a major treasury chest usually resulted in failure, noise, and the immediate deployment of the guards.
The assassin's technical abilities were almost always a patchwork of stolen knowledge and desperate improvisation, rarely rising to the level of true mastery that fiction often grants.
The constant need to identify weaknesses in a fortress or a victim's routine forced the assassin to become an unintentional master of psychology and human nature, learning to read the subtle body language of fear, boredom, or distraction that allowed him to pinpoint the momentary lapse in vigilance required to strike. He had to learn which types of noblemen drank too much wine before bed, which guards were prone to gambling away their wages, and which servants harbored secret grudges that could be exploited for a few coins and a moment of gossip.
This skill, this ability to exploit human frailty, was the assassin's greatest asset, born not of formal training, but of a ruthless, continuous observation of desperation and vice within the closed systems of feudal power. We should also discuss the primitive, yet vital, art of natural camouflage, realizing that the assassin's most effective disguise was often not a stolen uniform, but the ability to vanish into the natural background using nothing more than mud, shadow, and absolute stillness.
This involved learning to rub charcoal and animal grease onto exposed skin to eliminate the telltale pale gleam of human flesh in the moonlight, or covering oneself in leaves and damp earth to mimic the texture and smell of the forest floor.
Relying on the human eye's tendency to ignore what it expects to see.
This discipline required the assassin to suppress the human urge to move, to breathe shallowly, and to accept the discomfort of insects and dampness, existing for hours as a living part of the landscape, a far cry from the theatrical visibility of the fictional hooded figure.
The assassin's enduring lack of honorable burial was the final, unglamorous insult of the profession, realizing that even in death, the killer was permanently separated from the rest of humanity. If captured, he was executed, his body desecrated and displayed. If he died in the wilderness, he became food for scavengers.
And if he was paid for by the client, his remains were often disposed of in a quick, secret ceremony designed to destroy any evidence that the man ever existed. There was no headstone, no priest, and no communal mourning, ensuring that the assassin's journey ended not in peace, but in the final, cold reality of total, utter oblivion, a silent, forgotten ending that perfectly mirrored the life of violence and secrecy he had chosen. The ultimate constraint on the assassin's effectiveness was the sophisticated, multi-layered countermeasures adopted by the powerful targets themselves, who often lived in a state of continuous, active paranoia that transcended the simple employment of extra guards.
The nobleman did not simply fear the assassin's presence. He feared his own staff, leading to the institutionalization of the tasting ritual, a formalized process where every single item of food and drink from the morning wine to the nighttime broth had to be consumed by designated tasters, often loyal or expendable servants, before it was allowed to touch the Lord's lips.
This meant the poisonous target was never the victim, but the taster, creating a two-stage assassination problem where the killer had to successfully eliminate the initial human barrier without immediately alarming the target, a logistical puzzle that doubled the risk and the complexity of the task. This pervasive fear also extended to the target's clothing and bedding, leading to extreme precautions where clothes were meticulously checked for concealed needles or treated with oils, and beds were often sealed within heavy curtains or even placed upon raised platforms to ensure that any approach by a stealthy figure would create the smallest necessary sound. Noblemen frequently adopted the tactic of randomizing their sleeping locations, never sleeping in the same bedchamber 2 nights in a row, and never informing even their most trusted advisors of their precise whereabouts, forcing the assassin to abandon fixed surveillance and rely on continuous, exhausting tracking, which inherently amplified the risk of detection. The victim in this scenario was an active participant in the counter-assassination effort, using their power and wealth to create a shifting, unpredictable defense that often frustrated the killer into making a fatal, desperate move.
The fear of the dagger also created an entire shadow market of protective talismans and spiritual countermeasures, driven by the religious belief that the assassin was often aided by demonic forces or ill will, necessitating a spiritual defense alongside the physical one.
Noblemen paid exorbitant amounts for blessed amulets, relics, or protective charms, often entirely fraudulent, to be sewn into their clothing or placed beneath their pillows, believing that these objects possessed a tangible power to ward off the evil eye and the malicious intent of the killer. The assassin, operating in this heavily superstitious environment, had to contend not only with the physical reality of the gods, but also the psychological barrier created by the victim's absolute faith in their spiritual protection, knowing that if the assassination succeeded despite the talisman, the resulting public panic over the breakdown of spiritual defense would be even greater.
This atmosphere of pervasive anxiety led to a continuous, paranoid purging of the household, where the Lord would frequently and suddenly dismiss or execute trusted, long-serving servants based on nothing more than a whispered rumor, a bad dream, or a sudden loss of confidence.
These purges created a revolving door of new, unknown faces in the household, which paradoxically helped the assassin by providing opportunities for infiltration through temporary service roles, but also increased the risk, as the new, frightened servants were hyper-alert and quick to report anything suspicious to prove their own loyalty. The target's own fear became a self-destructive, but effective, security mechanism, creating a chaotic environment that was almost impossible for the assassin to analyze or predict.
The final, brutal reality is that the assassin's profession was an unwinnable economic conflict against power itself. Realizing that every countermeasure, the tasters, the extra guards, the randomization of rooms was infinitely cheap compared to the assassin's fee and the risk to his life.
The noble could always afford more suspicion, more steel, and more gold to neutralize the threat, whereas the assassin's resources were finite. His body was breakable, and his existence was measured in the brief, high-risk window between the contract signing and the inevitable moment when the defenses proved too strong. The life of the medieval assassin was therefore defined by a simple, grim equation, a desperate attempt to overcome infinite wealth and endless paranoia with nothing but a rusty blade and a borrowed hour of darkness.
We must pivot our focus to the highly specialized, unglamorous field of political and economic sabotage, realizing that the assassin was often utilized not to shed blood, but to inject financial chaos and systemic uncertainty into a rival's domain.
Methods that were less risky for the client and often more destructive to the victim's long-term power. This required the assassin to become an expert in economic vulnerability, understanding the fragility of medieval supply chains, the critical role of grain storage, and the dependence of a city on the continuous flow of trade along its rivers and roads.
Your mission might be to destroy the winter grain supply by discreetly poisoning the storage silos with vermin or fungal spores, an act that would not kill the noble immediately, but would cause a slow-motion famine among the populace, leading to civil unrest, riots, and the eventual
necessary collapse of the noble's authority due to starvation and public panic. This form of assassination was a cold, cruel game of patience, requiring the killer to operate without the immediate gratification of a successful strike, knowing that his work would only bear fruit months later when the effects of the sabotage became apparent, turning the populace against the ruler. The assassin was, in effect, a vector of instability, using basic chemistry and an understanding of logistics to turn a naturally occurring social problem into a political crisis, a method that required an immense detachment from the suffering he was intentionally causing.
The concept of character assassination also played a fundamental, essential role in preparing the ground for physical murder, recognizing that killing a beloved, respected ruler was politically far more dangerous than killing a man who was already publicly despised and rumored to be a traitor, a heretic, or a fool.
The assassin, or his intermediary, often spent weeks disseminating vicious, untraceable rumors about the target's incompetence, their secret worship of dark gods, or their corruption, often relying on the innate human tendency to believe the worst about the powerful. This psychological prelude was designed to socially isolate the victim, ensuring that when the actual murder took place, the surrounding nobility and the populace would greet the news not with outrage and a call for vengeance,
but with a shrug and a quiet acknowledgement that the victim had deserved their fate.
The assassin, therefore, was forced to act as a psychological warfare operative, using whispers and lies to strip the target of their most valuable defense, their public reputation, making the subsequent physical murder politically clean for the client. The greatest danger in this phase was being caught in the act of slander, as spreading treasonous rumors could lead to immediate, harsh punishment by the local court, often resulting in the public cutting out of the tongue or the branding of the face.
A painful humiliation that rendered the assassin useless for any further stealth work. Finally, the entire profession existed within the terrifying, fragile economic reality of feudal debt and taxation, realizing that the assassin was almost always a man running not just from the guards, but from crippling debt, a lost inheritance, a gambling loss, or a high tax levied by a grasping lord.
The contract was not just a means to get rich. It was a desperate attempt to repay an immediate, existential debt that threatened to plunge the assassin and his family into the abyss of permanent serfdom or prison. This deep, personal financial pressure amplified the need for success, ensuring that the assassin was frequently operating out of a state of profound desperation, which often translated into mistakes of recklessness and haste.
The true, unglamorous driving force behind the medieval assassin was not adventure or ideology, but the cold, cruel necessity of economic survival in a world where debt was a cage far stronger than any castle wall. We must acknowledge that the pervasive fear of sudden, inexplicable death by the assassin's hand extended beyond the noble courts, manifesting in countermeasures adopted by the common people themselves, particularly those who were suddenly elevated to positions of power or who possessed information that made them temporary targets.
The wealthy merchant, the successful guildmaster, or the corrupt magistrate, those figures who couldn't afford a massive castle or a retinue of tasters, resorted to more primitive, often superstitious defenses. This included the use of communal sleep, where a magistrate would force several trusted servants or even family members to sleep in the same room, believing that the noise and multiple bodies would deter a silent attacker, turning the simple act of rest into a continuous, suffocating exercise in shared anxiety.
This paranoia among the newly powerful also created a unique opportunity for the skilled assassin to adopt the disguise of the untouchable pariah. Realizing that certain marginalized groups were so feared and socially isolated that people avoided contact at all costs, providing a perfect shield of invisibility.
Impersonating a leper, for example, meant that the assassin could walk the roads and even approach the gates of a village without close scrutiny, as no guard or citizen was willing to risk physical contact or conversation, accepting the risk of contagion over the risk of the dagger. This was a profoundly desperate and unglamorous tactic, requiring the assassin to cover himself in crime, adopt a shuffling gait, and carry the telltale bell, accepting total social isolation as the price of operational freedom, transforming himself into a living, terrifying spectre of disease and fear. The necessity of acquiring local information without drawing suspicion led to the assassin's deep reliance on the dark economy of medieval games and gambling dens, realizing that these chaotic, often illegal gatherings were the perfect places to observe human weakness and gather untraceable information. The local gambling house was a nexus of disgruntled soldiers, indebted servants, and ambitious merchants, all of whom were willing to sell secrets or whisper vulnerabilities for a chance at coin.
The assassin often had to become a competent gambler himself, maintaining a facade of competence, while secretly observing the habits of a guard captain or the sudden wealth of a kitchen steward, using the noise and distraction of the dice and the cheers to mask his true purpose.
The risk, however, was immense, as a winning streak or a suspicious loss could lead to immediate violence, forcing the killer to constantly switch between the cold calculation of the mission and the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the card table. We must also acknowledge the brutal truth of the family cleanup, a grim task sometimes assigned to the assassin to eliminate not just the target, but their entire immediate family, wife, children, and closest kin, to ensure that the blood feud was permanently extinguished and the political vacancy created by the client was absolute. This meant the assassin was tasked with the utterly unheroic, horrifying job of killing women and children, acts that few men could carry out without profound psychological damage, regardless of their desperation or skill. This task stripped the assassin of any lingering romantic notion of honor or necessary evil, confirming his role as a simple, comprehensive executioner whose work was designed to be absolutely final and unforgiving, a cold instrument used to wipe out entire lines of succession. The final, quiet struggle of the assassin was often against his own failing memory and the fear of confession, realizing that years of continuous aliases, trauma, and lack of sleep degraded his ability to maintain the complex web of lies that formed his identity. Many captured assassins, under the threat of torture, confessed not just the truth, but vast amounts of false or confused information, mixing real names with aliases and true events with nightmares, further complicating the historical record and ensuring that the true narrative of the assassination was permanently lost in a fog of pain and terror.
The assassin's broken mind, therefore, became the final, unglamorous tool of historical obfuscation, ensuring that the shadows he lived in followed him even to the grave. We must address the specialized, functional skills that a surviving assassin might genuinely acquire, realizing that this necessary expertise was rarely gained in a formalized school, but was instead a brutal, self-directed curriculum acquired through high-stakes necessity, relentless practice, and the black market of skill. An assassin couldn't openly seek instruction in silent killing. He had to pay exorbitant amounts for adjacent, less suspicious forms of training. For instance, paying a master tanner or leatherworker to teach him the crucial, highly specialized art of crafting perfectly silent, soft-soled boots using specialized, oil-tanned leather that minimized squeaking and maximized grip on the uneven stone surfaces of a castle.
This was an expensive, non-negotiable expense, as the noisy, clunky footwear of a common soldier or peasant would betray the assassin instantly, forcing him to invest deeply in the primary tool of his stealth, the silent interface between his body and the hostile environment.
Similarly, the highly technical skill of lockpicking was not learned from a fictional grandmaster, but was slowly, painfully acquired by bribing disgraced blacksmiths or paying low-level thieves for a single, critical lesson and the loan of a few rudimentary rakes and tension wrenches.
This knowledge was almost always rudimentary and incomplete, teaching the assassin only the crudest methods required to force a simple, poorly warded lock, meaning that confronting the complex, multi-layered tumblers on a major treasury chest usually resulted in the immediate failure of the tools, excessive noise, and the swift deployment of the guards.
The assassin's technical abilities were almost always a patchwork of stolen, partial knowledge and desperate improvisation, rarely rising to the level of true, reliable mastery that fiction often grants these shadow figures.
The constant need to identify weaknesses in a fortress or a victim's routine forced the assassin to become an unintentional master of psychological profiling and practical human nature, learning to read the subtle, fleeting body language of fear, boredom,
or distraction that allowed him to pinpoint the momentary lapse in vigilance required to strike.
He had to learn which types of noblemen habitually drank too much wine before retiring, which specific guards were prone to gambling away their wages, and which key servants harbored secret grudges that could be exploited for a few coins and a moment of unguarded gossip.
This skill, this ability to exploit human frailty and vice, was the assassin's most reliable and consistently valuable asset, born not of formal training, but of a ruthless, continuous, and cynical observation of desperation and vice within the closed systems of feudal power.
We should also delve into the primitive, yet absolutely vital, art of natural camouflage, realizing that the assassin's most effective disguise was often not a stolen uniform, but the ability to vanish entirely into the natural background using nothing more than mud, shadow, and absolute stillness. This involved learning to rub charcoal and animal grease onto exposed skin to eliminate the telltale pale gleam of human flesh in the moonlight, or covering oneself in leaves, brush, and damp earth to mimic the texture and smell of the forest floor,
relying on the human eye's tendency to ignore what it expects to see.
This discipline required the assassin to suppress the natural human urge to move, to breathe shallowly, and to stoically accept the continuous discomfort of insects and freezing dampness, existing for hours as a living, silent part of the landscape, a stark contrast to the dramatic, theatrical visibility of the fictional hooded figure. The assassin's enduring lack of honorable, proper burial was the final, unglamorous insult of the profession, realizing that even in death, the killer was permanently separated from the rest of humanity and denied the comforting rituals of the age.
If captured, he was executed, his body desecrated and displayed.
If he died in the wilderness, he became food for scavengers, and if he was paid for by the client, his remains were often disposed of in a quick, secret ceremony designed specifically to destroy any physical evidence that the man ever existed. There was no headstone, no priest, and no communal mourning, ensuring that the assassin's journey ended not in peace, but in the final, cold reality of total, utter oblivion, a silent, forgotten ending that perfectly mirrored the life of violence and secrecy he had chosen.
We must now confront the horrifying reality of injury and primitive healthcare for the medieval assassin, realizing that the ability to self-treat and manage infection was often more critical to long-term survival than skill with a weapon.
In an age where even a splinter could lead to a fatal case of septicemia, the assassin's medical kit consisted of crude instruments, a dirty knife for lancing boils, rough linen for bandaging, and a strong, cheap spirit, often raw brandy, used indiscriminately as both anesthetic and antiseptic.
He had to be his own surgeon, performing agonizing procedures like cauterizing deep wounds with a red-hot iron, an act of self-mutilation undertaken not for bravery, but for the cold necessity of survival, knowing that screaming would attract the immediate attention of anyone within earshot.
The continuous, low-level pain from untreated broken bones, chronic joint inflammation caused by sleeping on cold, damp ground, and persistent skin infections meant that the assassin was almost always operating at a physical disadvantage, fighting his own failing body as much as the castle guards. This persistent state of physical degradation meant that the average assassin had an operational lifespan of perhaps only 3 to 5 high-risk years before injury, disease, or fatigue rendered him too slow, too unreliable, or too recognizable by his chronic limp or persistent cough to continue the trade. The long-lived, legendary master assassin is a total fantasy. The reality was a broken, scarred man praying for a quick end to his suffering. The necessity of food security was another unglamorous, constant threat, forcing the assassin to become a highly skilled, silent poacher and forager in the hostile wilderness, stealing food not just for sustenance, but for the very energy required to execute the mission.
He couldn't risk buying food in the open market near a target, so he relied on snares to catch small game, on his knowledge of edible but bland roots and berries, and on the simple, dangerous act of stealing ripe vegetables from open fields under the cover of night. This reliance on stolen, often uncooked or poorly preserved food led to constant bouts of stomach illness and malnutrition, further weakening the body and degrading the focus required for high-stakes work, confirming that the assassin's primary logistical concern was often finding his next safe meager meal. We must also touch on the specialized logistics of the dead drop, the PI arranged, secretive location used to pass messages, payments, or specialized tools without ever meeting the client or the intermediary face-to-face, a method designed to protect both parties from exposure.
This involved weeks of planning, ensuring the chosen location, perhaps a loose stone in an ancient wall, a hollow in a specific oak tree, or a submerged wooden box in a slow-moving river, was remote, memorable, and visible from a distance for surveillance purposes.
The act of checking a dead drop was itself a tense, high-risk operation, requiring the assassin to spend hours observing the area from a distant vantage point, fighting the urge to approach and retrieve the goods.
Knowing that the location was the most common place for an ambush staged by either the client's guards or the trackers, the ultimate, final struggle for the medieval assassin was not against the guard's sword, but against absolute anonymity, the psychological toll of existing as an untraceable, unremembered shadow. He had no official records, no legitimate life, and no one to mourn him, ensuring that the only lasting record of his existence was the silent, terrible void he left in the life of his victim. The silver coin, the objective measure of the life, was a poor substitute for the soul, and the glamour of the assassin is merely a modern mythology imposed upon a reality of sickness, pain, and utter, relentless insignificance.
We must now confront the horrifying reality of injury and primitive healthcare for the medieval assassin, realizing that the ability to self-treat and manage infection was often more critical to long-term survival than skill with a weapon.
In an age where even a splinter could lead to a fatal case of septicemia, the assassin's medical kit consisted of crude instruments, a dirty knife for lancing boils, rough linen for bandaging, and a strong, cheap spirit, often raw brandy, used indiscriminately as both anesthetic and antiseptic. He had to be his own surgeon, performing agonizing procedures like cauterizing deep wounds with a red-hot iron, an act of self-mutilation undertaken not for bravery, but for the cold necessity of survival, knowing that screaming would attract the immediate attention of anyone within earshot. The continuous, low-level pain from untreated broken bones, chronic joint inflammation caused by sleeping on cold, damp ground, and persistent skin infections meant that the assassin was almost always operating at a physical disadvantage, fighting his own failing body as much as the castle guards. This persistent state of physical degradation meant that the average assassin had an operational lifespan of perhaps only 3 to 5 high-risk years before injury, disease, or fatigue rendered him too slow, too unreliable, or too recognizable by his chronic limp or persistent cough to continue the trade. The long-lived, legendary master assassin is a total fantasy. The reality was a broken, scarred man praying for a quick end to his suffering. The necessity of food security was another unglamorous, constant threat, forcing the assassin to become a highly skilled, silent poacher and forager in the hostile wilderness, stealing food not just for sustenance, but for the very energy required to execute the mission.
He couldn't risk buying food in the open market near a target, so he relied on snares to catch small game, on his knowledge of edible but bland roots and berries, and on the simple, dangerous act of stealing ripe vegetables from open fields under the cover of night. This reliance on stolen, often uncooked or poorly preserved food led to constant bouts of stomach illness and malnutrition, further weakening the body and degrading the focus required for high-stakes work, confirming that the assassin's primary logistical concern was often finding his next safe meager meal. We must also touch on the specialized logistics of the dead drop, the PI-arranged, secretive location used to pass messages, payments, or specialized tools without ever meeting the client or the intermediary face-to-face, a method designed to protect both parties from exposure.
This involved weeks of planning, ensuring the chosen location, perhaps a loose stone in an ancient wall, a hollow in a specific oak tree, or a submerged wooden box in a slow-moving river, was remote, memorable, and visible from a distance for surveillance purposes.
The act of checking a dead drop was itself a tense, high-risk operation, requiring the assassin to spend hours observing the area from a distant vantage point, fighting the urge to approach and retrieve the goods.
Knowing that the location was the most common place for an ambush staged by either the client's guards or the trackers, the ultimate, final struggle for the medieval assassin was not against the guard's sword, but against absolute anonymity, the psychological toll of existing as an untraceable, unremembered shadow. He had no official records, no legitimate life, and no one to mourn him, ensuring that the only lasting record of his existence was the silent, terrible void he left in the life of his victim. The silver coin, the objective measure of the life, was a poor substitute for the soul, and the glamour of the assassin is merely a modern mythology imposed upon a reality of sickness, pain, and utter, relentless insignificance.
We must address the specialized, functional skills that a surviving assassin might genuinely acquire, realizing that this necessary expertise was rarely gained in a formalized school, but was instead a brutal, self-directed curriculum acquired through high-stakes necessity, relentless practice, and the black market of skill.
An assassin couldn't openly seek instruction in silent killing.
He had to pay exorbitant amounts for adjacent, less suspicious forms of training. For instance, paying a master tanner or leatherworker to teach him the crucial, highly specialized art of crafting perfectly silent, soft-soled boots using specialized, oil-tanned leather that minimized squeaking and maximized grip on the uneven stone surfaces of a castle.
This was an expensive, non-negotiable expense, as the noisy, clunky footwear of a common soldier or peasant would betray the assassin instantly, forcing him to invest deeply in the primary tool of his stealth, the silent interface between his body and the hostile environment.
Similarly, the highly technical skill of lockpicking was not learned from a fictional grandmaster, but was slowly, painfully acquired by bribing disgraced blacksmiths or paying low-level thieves for a single, critical lesson and the loan of a few rudimentary rakes and tension wrenches.
This knowledge was almost always rudimentary and incomplete, teaching the assassin only the crudest methods required to force a simple, poorly warded lock, meaning that confronting the complex, multi-layered tumblers on a major treasury chest usually resulted in the immediate failure of the tools, excessive noise, and the swift deployment of the guards. The assassin's technical abilities were almost always a patchwork of stolen, partial knowledge and desperate improvisation, rarely rising to the level of true, reliable mastery that fiction often grants these shadow figures. The constant need to identify weaknesses in a fortress or a victim's routine forced the assassin to become an unintentional master of psychological profiling and practical human nature, learning to read the subtle, fleeting body language of fear, boredom, or distraction that allowed him to pinpoint the momentary lapse in vigilance required to strike. He had to learn which types of noblemen habitually drank too much wine before retiring, which specific guards were prone to gambling away their wages, and which key servants harbored secret grudges that could be exploited for a few coins and a moment of unguarded gossip. This skill, this ability to exploit human frailty and vice, was the assassin's most reliable and consistently valuable asset, born not of formal training, but of a ruthless, continuous, and cynical observation of desperation and vice within the closed systems of feudal power. We should also delve into the primitive, yet absolutely vital, art of natural camouflage, realizing that the assassin's most effective disguise was often not a stolen uniform, but the ability to vanish entirely into the natural background using nothing more than mud, shadow, and absolute stillness. This involved learning to rub charcoal and animal grease onto exposed skin to eliminate the telltale pale gleam of human flesh in the moonlight, or covering oneself in leaves, brush, and damp earth to mimic the texture and smell of the forest floor.
Relying on the human eye's tendency to ignore what it expects to see.
This discipline required the assassin to suppress the natural human urge to move, to breathe shallowly, and to stoically accept the continuous discomfort of insects and freezing dampness, existing for hours as a living, silent part of the landscape, a stark contrast to the dramatic, theatrical visibility of the fictional hooded figure. The assassin's enduring lack of honorable, proper burial was the final, unglamorous insult of the profession, realizing that even in death, the killer was permanently separated from the rest of humanity and denied the comforting rituals of the age.
If captured, he was executed, his body desecrated and displayed.
If he died in the wilderness, he became food for scavengers. And if he was paid for by the client, his remains were often disposed of in a quick, secret ceremony designed specifically to destroy any physical evidence that the man ever existed. There was no headstone, no priest, and no communal mourning, ensuring that the assassin's journey ended not in peace, but in the final, cold reality of total, utter oblivion, a silent, forgotten ending that perfectly mirrored the life of violence and secrecy he had chosen.
We must address the specialized, functional skills that a surviving assassin might genuinely acquire. Realizing that this necessary expertise was rarely gained in a formalized school, but was instead a brutal, self-directed curriculum acquired through high-stakes necessity, relentless practice, and the black market of skill.
An assassin couldn't openly seek instruction in silent killing.
He had to pay exorbitant amounts for adjacent, less suspicious forms of training. For instance, paying a master tanner or leatherworker to teach him the crucial, highly specialized art of crafting perfectly silent, soft-soled boots using specialized,
oil-tanned leather that minimized squeaking and maximized grip on the uneven stone surfaces of a castle. This was an expensive, non-negotiable expense, as the noisy, clunky footwear of a common soldier or peasant would betray the assassin instantly, forcing him to invest deeply in the primary tool of his stealth, the silent interface between his body and the hostile environment. Similarly, the highly technical skill of lockpicking was not learned from a fictional grandmaster, but was slowly, painfully acquired by bribing disgraced blacksmiths or paying low-level thieves for a single, critical lesson and the loan of a few rudimentary rakes and tension wrenches. This knowledge was almost always rudimentary and incomplete, teaching the assassin only the crudest methods required to force a simple, poorly warded lock, meaning that confronting the complex, multi-layered tumblers on a major treasury chest usually resulted in the immediate failure of the tools, excessive noise, and the swift deployment of the guards. The assassin's technical abilities were almost always a patchwork of stolen, partial knowledge and desperate improvisation, rarely rising to the level of true, reliable mastery that fiction often grants these shadow figures. The constant need to identify weaknesses in a fortress or a victim's routine forced the assassin to become an unintentional master of psychological profiling and practical human nature, learning to read the subtle, fleeting body language of fear, boredom, or distraction that allowed him to pinpoint the momentary lapse in vigilance required to strike. He had to learn which types of noblemen habitually drank too much wine before retiring, which specific guards were prone to gambling away their wages, and which key servants harbored secret grudges that could be exploited for a few coins and a moment of unguarded gossip. This skill, this ability to exploit human frailty and vice, was the assassin's most reliable and consistently valuable asset, born not of formal training, but of a ruthless, continuous, and cynical observation of desperation and vice within the closed systems of feudal power. We should also delve into the primitive, yet absolutely vital, art of natural camouflage, realizing that the assassin's most effective disguise was often not a stolen uniform, but the ability to vanish entirely into the natural background using nothing more than mud, shadow, and absolute stillness. This involved learning to rub charcoal and animal grease onto exposed skin to eliminate the telltale pale gleam of human flesh in the moonlight, or covering oneself in leaves, brush, and damp earth to mimic the texture and smell of the forest floor.
Relying on the human eye's tendency to ignore what it expects to see.
This discipline required the assassin to suppress the natural human urge to move, to breathe shallowly, and to stoically accept the continuous discomfort of insects and freezing dampness, existing for hours as a living, silent part of the landscape, a stark contrast to the dramatic, theatrical visibility of the fictional hooded figure. The assassin's enduring lack of honorable, proper burial was the final,
unglamorous insult of the profession, realizing that even in death, the killer was permanently separated from the rest of humanity and denied the comforting rituals of the age. If captured, he was executed, his body desecrated and displayed. If he died in the wilderness, he became food for scavengers.
And if he was paid for by the client, his remains were often disposed of in a quick, secret ceremony designed specifically to destroy any physical evidence that the man ever existed. There was no headstone, no priest, and no communal mourning, ensuring that the assassin's journey ended not in peace, but in the final, cold reality of total, utter oblivion, a silent, forgotten ending that perfectly mirrored the life of violence and secrecy he had chosen.
We must address the specialized, functional skills that a surviving assassin might genuinely acquire. Realizing that this necessary expertise was rarely gained in a formalized school, but was instead a brutal, self-directed curriculum acquired through high-stakes necessity, relentless practice, and the black market of skill. An assassin couldn't openly seek instruction in silent killing. He had to pay exorbitant amounts for adjacent, less suspicious forms of training. For instance, paying a master tanner or leatherworker to teach him the crucial, highly specialized art of crafting perfectly silent, soft-soled boots using specialized, oil-tanned leather that minimized squeaking and maximized grip on the uneven stone surfaces of a castle.
This was an expensive, non-negotiable expense, as the noisy, clunky footwear of a common soldier or peasant would betray the assassin instantly, forcing him to invest deeply in the primary tool of his stealth, the silent interface between his body and the hostile environment. Similarly, the highly technical skill of lockpicking was not learned from a fictional grandmaster, but was slowly, painfully acquired by bribing disgraced blacksmiths or paying low-level thieves for a single, critical lesson and the loan of a few rudimentary rakes and tension wrenches. This knowledge was almost always rudimentary and incomplete, teaching the assassin only the crudest methods required to force a simple, poorly warded lock, meaning that confronting the complex, multi-layered tumblers on a major treasury chest usually resulted in the immediate failure of the tools, excessive noise, and the swift deployment of the guards. The assassin's technical abilities were almost always a patchwork of stolen, partial knowledge and desperate improvisation, rarely rising to the level of true, reliable mastery that fiction often grants these shadow figures. The constant need to identify weaknesses in a fortress or a victim's routine forced the assassin to become an unintentional master of psychological profiling and practical human nature, learning to read the subtle, fleeting body language of fear, boredom, or distraction that allowed him to pinpoint the momentary lapse in vigilance required to strike. He had to learn which types of noblemen habitually drank too much wine before retiring, which specific guards were prone to gambling away their wages, and which key servants harbored secret grudges that could be exploited for a few coins and a moment of unguarded gossip. This skill, this ability to exploit human frailty and vice, was the assassin's most reliable and consistently valuable asset, born not of formal training, but of a ruthless, continuous, and cynical observation of desperation and vice within the closed systems of feudal power. We should also delve into the primitive, yet absolutely vital, art of natural camouflage, realizing that the assassin's most effective disguise was often not a stolen uniform, but the ability to vanish entirely into the natural background using nothing more than mud, shadow, and absolute stillness. This involved learning to rub charcoal and animal grease onto exposed skin to eliminate the telltale pale gleam of human flesh in the moonlight, or covering oneself in leaves, brush, and damp earth to mimic the texture and smell of the forest floor, relying on the human eye's tendency to ignore what it expects to see. This discipline required the assassin to suppress the natural human urge to move, to breathe shallowly, and to stoically accept the continuous discomfort of insects and freezing dampness, existing for hours as a living, silent part of the landscape, a stark contrast to the dramatic, theatrical visibility of the fictional hooded figure. The assassin's enduring lack of honorable, proper burial was the final, unglamorous insult of the profession, realizing that even in death, the killer was permanently separated from the rest of humanity and denied the comforting rituals of the age. If captured, he was executed, his body desecrated and displayed. If he died in the wilderness, he became food for scavengers. And if he was paid for by the client, his remains were often disposed of in a quick, secret ceremony designed specifically to destroy any physical evidence that the man ever existed. There was no headstone, no priest, and no communal mourning, ensuring that the assassin's journey ended not in peace, but in the final, cold reality of total, utter oblivion, a silent, forgotten ending that perfectly mirrored the life of violence and secrecy he had chosen.
We must address the specialized functional skills that a surviving assassin might genuinely acquire. Realizing that this necessary expertise was rarely gained in a formalized school, but was instead a brutal, self-directed curriculum acquired through high-stakes necessity, relentless practice, and the black market of skill. An assassin couldn't openly seek instruction in silent killing. He had to pay exorbitant amounts for adjacent, less suspicious forms of training. For instance, paying a master tanner or leatherworker to teach him the crucial, highly specialized art of crafting perfectly silent, soft-soled boots using specialized, oil-tanned leather that minimized squeaking and maximized grip on the uneven stone surfaces of a castle.
This was an expensive, non-negotiable expense, as the noisy, clunky footwear of a common soldier or peasant would betray the assassin instantly, forcing him to invest deeply in the primary tool of his stealth, the silent interface between his body and the hostile environment.
Similarly, the highly technical skill of lockpicking was not learned from a fictional grandmaster, but was slowly, painfully acquired by bribing disgraced blacksmiths or paying low-level thieves for a single, critical lesson and the loan of a few rudimentary rakes and tension wrenches.
This knowledge was almost always rudimentary and incomplete, teaching the assassin only the crudest methods required to force a simple, poorly warded lock, meaning that confronting the complex, multi-layered tumblers on a major treasury chest usually resulted in the immediate failure of the tools, excessive noise, and the swift deployment of the guards.
The assassin's technical abilities were almost always a patchwork of stolen, partial knowledge and desperate improvisation, rarely rising to the level of true, reliable mastery that fiction often grants these shadow figures.
The constant need to identify weaknesses in a fortress or a victim's routine forced the assassin to become an unintentional master of psychological profiling and practical human nature, learning to read the subtle, fleeting body language of fear, boredom, or distraction that allowed him to pinpoint the momentary lapse in vigilance required to strike. He had to learn which types of noblemen habitually drank too much wine before retiring, which specific guards were prone to gambling away their wages, and which key servants harbored secret grudges that could be exploited for a few coins and a moment of unguarded gossip.
This skill, this ability to exploit human frailty and vice, was the assassin's most reliable and consistently valuable asset, born not of formal training, but of a ruthless, continuous, and cynical observation of desperation and vice within the closed systems of feudal power.
We should also delve into the primitive, yet absolutely vital, art of natural camouflage, realizing that the assassin's most effective disguise was often not a stolen uniform, but the ability to vanish entirely into the natural background using nothing more than mud, shadow, and absolute stillness. This involved learning to rub charcoal and animal grease onto exposed skin to eliminate the telltale pale gleam of human flesh in the moonlight, or covering oneself in leaves, brush, and damp earth to mimic the texture and smell of the forest floor,
relying on the human eye's tendency to ignore what it expects to see.
This discipline required the assassin to suppress the natural human urge to move, to breathe shallowly, and to stoically accept the continuous discomfort of insects and freezing dampness, existing for hours as a living, silent part of the landscape, a stark contrast to the dramatic, theatrical visibility of the fictional hooded figure. The assassin's enduring lack of honorable, proper burial was the final, unglamorous insult of the profession, realizing that even in death, the killer was permanently separated from the rest of humanity and denied the comforting rituals of the age.
If captured, he was executed, his body desecrated and displayed.
If he died in the wilderness, he became food for scavengers, and if he was paid for by the client, his remains were often disposed of in a quick, secret ceremony designed specifically to destroy any physical evidence that the man ever existed. There was no headstone, no priest, and no communal mourning, ensuring that the assassin's journey ended not in peace, but in the final, cold reality of total, utter oblivion, a silent, forgotten ending that perfectly mirrored the life of violence and secrecy he had chosen.
We must address the specialized functional skills that a surviving assassin might genuinely acquire. Realizing that this necessary expertise was rarely gained in a formalized school, but was instead a brutal, self-directed curriculum acquired through high-stakes necessity, relentless practice, and the black market of skill.
An assassin couldn't openly seek instruction in silent killing.
He had to pay exorbitant amounts for adjacent, less suspicious forms of training. For instance, paying a master tanner or leatherworker to teach him the crucial, highly specialized art of crafting perfectly silent, soft-soled boots using specialized,
oil-tanned leather that minimized squeaking and maximized grip on the uneven stone surfaces of a castle. This was an expensive, non-negotiable expense, as the noisy, clunky footwear of a common soldier or peasant would betray the assassin instantly, forcing him to invest deeply in the primary tool of his stealth, the silent interface between his body and the hostile environment. Similarly, the highly technical skill of lockpicking was not learned from a fictional grandmaster, but was slowly, painfully acquired by bribing disgraced blacksmiths or paying low-level thieves for a single, critical lesson and the loan of a few rudimentary rakes and tension wrenches. This knowledge was almost always rudimentary and incomplete, teaching the assassin only the crudest methods required to force a simple, poorly warded lock, meaning that confronting the complex, multi-layered tumblers on a major treasury chest usually resulted in the immediate failure of the tools, excessive noise, and the swift deployment of the guards. The assassin's technical abilities were almost always a patchwork of stolen, partial knowledge and desperate improvisation, rarely rising to the level of true, reliable mastery that fiction often grants these shadow figures. The constant need to identify weaknesses in a fortress or a victim's routine forced the assassin to become an unintentional master of psychological profiling and practical human nature, learning to read the subtle, fleeting body language of fear, boredom, or distraction that allowed him to pinpoint the momentary lapse in vigilance required to strike. He had to learn which types of noblemen habitually drank too much wine before retiring, which specific guards were prone to gambling away their wages, and which key servants harbored secret grudges that could be exploited for a few coins and a moment of unguarded gossip. This skill, this ability to exploit human frailty and vice, was the assassin's most reliable and consistently valuable asset, born not of formal training, but of a ruthless, continuous, and cynical observation of desperation and vice within the closed systems of feudal power.